Chapter 1. The warehouse district of Muzidafu smelled like rust and rain, and Izuku Midoriya had learned to love that smell, because it usually meant someone was about to be found. He moved along the rooftops without a sound, his boots finding the gaps in corrugated steel out of habit rather than thought. 3 years of practice condensed into the kind of muscle memory that no longer needed his attention. Beneath him, the warehouses sprawled in a grid of collapsed ownership and forgotten leases, the kind of place the official hero charts did not bother to patrol because there was no glory in it, no footage for the morning news, nothing but the low hum of a missing persons case that had gone cold 3 weeks ago. He had not gone cold on it. He never did. The file in his jacket pocket was soft at the corners from handling. A courier, 26 years old, last seen near this district after reporting a strange light from one of the warehouses. The police had searched twice and found nothing. Izuku had read the report 4 times and found a pattern. Every warehouse the police canvassed had been chosen because it was easy to search, not because it was likely. He had spent the last 2 nights ruling out the easy buildings so that tonight he could stand in front of the hard one. It rose in front of him now, a hunched shape of dark metal with a roof that had partially given way to the weather, vines growing through a hole that let the rain in but kept anyone looking down from above from seeing much of anything. He crouched on the lip of the building beside it and let his breathing slow. This was the part of the work that no one filmed. Not the strength, not the speed, just the patience to look at 12 identical buildings and ask which one nobody wanted to be found in. He dropped down into the gap in the roof feet first, absorbing the landing through bent knees, and came up already scanning. Empty crates. A floor slick with old oil. And near the back wall, behind a stack of pallets that had been moved recently enough to leave clean lines in the dust, a door that did not belong to a warehouse. It was reinforced. It had a keypad. Izuku did not believe in waiting for permission when a life was on the other side of a locked door. He did not believe, either, in announcing himself with force he did not have. His quirk had never been the kind that broke doors. He pressed his palm flat against the keypad's housing instead, feeling for the give in the metal casing, and worked his fingers into the gap with the kind of patient mechanical sense his mother used to tease him about, back when he was small enough to spend whole afternoons taking apart a broken radio just to understand why it had stopped working. The casing came loose. The wiring inside was simple, factory grade, nothing built to resist someone who knew where to look. The door clicked open onto a stairwell going down. The air changed as he descended, growing warmer, faintly metallic, like the inside of an old kettle. He heard the courier before he saw her, a thin, ragged breathing from a room at the bottom of the stairs, behind a second door that had not been locked because whoever had put her there had not expected anyone to get this far. She was alive. Dehydrated, bound, terrified, but alive, and when he knelt beside her and cut the cord around her wrists with the small blade he carried for exactly this purpose, she flinched away from him before her eyes focused enough to understand that he was not the person who had put her there. "You're safe," he said, low and even, the same tone he used every time, because he had learned that the tone mattered more than the words. "I'm going to get you out. Can you walk, or do you need me to carry you?" She could not walk. He carried her. It was 40 minutes later, after the police had taken his statement and the paramedics had taken the courier and the warehouse had filled with the kind of official attention that always arrived after the dangerous part was over, that a detective Izuku recognized from 3 previous cases approached him with a folder under her arm and a look on her face that told him she had more bad news than good. "She's going to be fine," the detective said. "Whoever took her wasn't planning to kill her. We think she saw something she wasn't supposed to see." "Saw what?" "That's the part you're not going to like." The detective opened the folder enough for him to see a photograph clipped to the inside, a heat-blurred security still from a different case, weeks old, showing a shape that had once been a man and was now mostly cracked stone, kneeling in the center of a small room with both arms outstretched as if reaching for something that was not there anymore. "We pulled this off a separate scene 2 districts over. Same signature on the door locks. Same pattern of an isolated building nobody would think to search." Izuku looked at the photograph for a long time. What was his quirk, he said. It was not really a question. Petrification, triggered by sustained physical contact. Strong one. Top 100 candidate before he went missing 8 months ago. The detective closed the folder. We don't know what did that to him. We don't know if he's even still alive in there, or if that's all that's left. Has this happened before? 3 confirmed cases in the last year that we can tie together. All transformation types. All beast types. All gone quiet right after, sometimes for weeks before anyone even reports them missing, because half of them work alone and nobody checks in. She watched his face carefully. You've been doing this kind of work long enough that I'm guessing you already had a file open on something like this. He had. It lived in the back corner of a notebook he kept at his apartment, 3 names long, none of them solved, all of them heroes the official charts had stopped tracking because they were inconvenient, abrasive, solo, or simply not famous enough to be worth a task force. He had told himself for months that it was a coincidence waiting for an explanation. He did not believe that anymore. Thank you for telling me, he said. Don't thank me. I'm telling you because I want you to be careful, not because I want you running toward it. The detective's voice softened, just slightly, the way it did every time she remembered that the underground rescue work he did had no agency behind it, no team, no backup beyond whatever favors she could quietly arrange. You're good at finding people nobody else is looking for. That's not nothing. But whatever did this to a top 100 hero is not going to care how good you are at picking locks. Izuku folded the file back into his jacket pocket, beside the courier's case that was now finally closed, and looked out at the warehouse district disappearing into the dark beyond the police lights. I'm not trying to be a top 100 hero, he said. I never wanted that. I know. She studied him for a moment longer. I've never quite figured out what you do want, Midoriya. Most people in this line of work want the rankings, or the money, or the cameras. You don't seem to want any of it. He thought about the question longer than she probably expected him to. I want to build something, he said finally. Somewhere people who fall through every other crack can land. I don't know what that looks like yet. I just know it isn't a ranking. She did not have a response for that, and he did not offer one, and a few minutes later he was walking back toward his apartment alone, the way he always was after a case closed, turning the 3 names in his backup notebook over in his mind and wondering, for the first time with real unease, whether the gap between his work and the kind of work that made the news was about to close on its own. He had no way of knowing yet that the closest of those 3 names belonged to a woman who would, within the week, be fighting for her own life in a transformation she could no longer control. The night was quiet. He did not enjoy it the way he used to. Chapter 2. Pac Bond had manifested when Izuku was 9, and it had taken him until he was 16 to stop apologizing for it. The quirk did not look like much on paper. He could form a bond with another person through sustained physical contact and clear intent on both sides, and once the bond was formed, he could draw a portion of their exhaustion, their pain, and their physical strain into himself, distributing it across his own stamina so that the bonded person could keep functioning past the point their body would otherwise have given out. It worked in both directions if the other person chose to let it. In theory, he could push some of his own conditioning back toward them as well, though in practice he rarely needed to, because he had spent years training his body specifically to be a vessel for other people's exhaustion. He could not heal anyone. He could not give anyone power they did not already have. All he could do was carry what was already theirs to carry, and carry it for slightly longer than they could have carried it alone. When he was younger, counselors at his middle school had called it a support quirk and filed it away as unremarkable, the kind of ability that might make him useful as a sidekick someday if he trained hard enough to be worth bonding to. He had spent his entire childhood being told, gently and not so gently, that quirks like his existed to serve quirks like everyone else's. Even All Might, in the brief season when Izuku had still let himself dream about inheriting one for all before a different successor was chosen and his life took a path nobody had planned for him, had praised Pac Bond as the kind of quirk a great hero's partner might need. Never the kind a great hero himself would need. It had taken him years to understand that the dreaming had blinded him to the obvious truth sitting in plain sight inside his own ability. Pac Bond was not built to make him someone's partner. It was built to make him someone's foundation, if he let it, and a foundation did not have to be small. A foundation could hold up something enormous, if it was the right shape and it was given enough time. He never went to UA. The path that led there had narrowed and closed for reasons that had stopped feeling significant years ago, swallowed by everything that came after, and in their place he had built something quieter, a string of internships with underground heroes who did not care about flashy quirks, a license earned through the kind of testing that rewarded patience over power, and eventually this, a one-man operation with no name on the door, no agency registration beyond the bare legal minimum, no sponsor, and a growing reputation among detectives and desperate families for finding people that nobody else would look for. He liked the work because it suited the shape of what he could do. He had never been able to save someone with strength alone. He had only ever been able to save someone by being willing to carry a portion of what they were carrying, for exactly as long as it took to get them somewhere safe. What he had not expected, not once in 7 years of quietly building this life, was that the same ability that let him share a stranger's exhaustion during a rescue might someday let him understand, more intimately than almost anyone alive, what it cost a person to live permanently transformed. He thought about that sometimes, late at night, staring at the 3 names in his backup notebook. Ryukyu. Mirko. A third name he had only recently added, underlined twice, belonging to a young Earth Quirk hero whose public appearances had grown shorter and more erratic over the past 2 months in a way nobody else seemed to have noticed. All 3 of them carried something most people never had to think about, a body that did more than the one they were born into, an extra cost paid every single day just to access their own strength. Ryukyu's draconic transformation drained her so completely that she rationed her hours in that form like a budget she was always close to overspending. Mirko's quirk demanded a price from her joints and tendons that she had been quietly outrunning for years through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to slow down. The Earth Quirk hero, whoever she truly was beneath the persona, had always struck Izuku as someone running a marathon she had never agreed to enter. He understood, better than most, what it meant to live inside a body that asked you to pay for every use of yourself. His own quirk had taught him that lesson by forcing him to absorb other people's debts for a living. He had never once thought of helping them as taming anything. The word made his skin crawl when he encountered it in old support quirk literature from decades past, papers that spoke of certain ability types being suited to stabilizing or anchoring more volatile quirks, as though a person's body were a problem to be managed rather than a life to be respected. He intended, if he ever got close enough to any of the 3 names in his notebook to actually help, to make sure they understood the difference between being carried and being owned. He had seen what happened to support-type heroes who let themselves be reduced to tools for someone else's convenience. He was not going to become someone who did that to anyone, least of all to women who had already spent their entire careers being underestimated, isolated, or quietly worn down by quirks the rest of the hero world treated as either a spectacle or an inconvenience. He had a half-formed dream, the kind he had never said aloud to anyone, of a place built specifically for people like that. Not an agency with a flashy name and merchandise, but a sanctuary with real walls and real support staff and real recovery time, where the cost of an extraordinary quirk did not have to be paid alone every single day for the rest of a hero's working life. He had no funding for it. He had no team. He had, at this point in his life, exactly 1 apartment, 1 motorcycle held together by his own repairs, a license that let him operate at the edges of the legal hero industry, and a notebook full of names belonging to people he had never met. It was not much of a dynasty. But it was the only thing he had ever wanted to build, and he had learned a long time ago that wanting something quietly and for a long time was usually how the largest things eventually got built. 3 days later, the first of those 3 names called for help, though not in any way Izuku could have predicted, and not in any way that gave him time to prepare. Chapter 3. Ryukyu had not meant to stay transformed this long. She knew the math of her own body the way other people knew their bank balance, a running tally she checked instinctively and obsessively, because the draconic form that made her one of the strongest heroes in Japan also charged her a price that compounded the longer she stayed inside it. An hour was comfortable. 3 hours was a calculated risk she took only in genuine emergencies. 6 hours was something she had done exactly twice in her career, both times against villains capable of leveling city blocks, both times followed by a recovery period that had frightened her agency staff badly enough that they had quietly increased her support team afterward. She was 11 hours in now, and there was no agency staff anywhere nearby to notice. It had started as a routine call, a containment job on the outskirts of the city where reports had come in of a transformation-type villain attacking isolated targets. She had transformed at the outset because the terrain favored her draconic form, broad and open, good sightlines, room to use her full size without endangering bystanders. She remembered engaging the villain. She remembered the strange sensation partway through the fight, a pulling feeling deep in whatever part of her body generated the transformation in the first place, as though something were trying to find the seam where her human shape ended and her dragon shape began and pry it wider. She did not remember losing the ability to shift back. She knew it had happened because she had tried, repeatedly, for what her internal clock insisted had been hours, crouched now in the collapsed remains of a parking structure at the edge of the containment zone, her enormous draconic body wedged into a space too small for it, every attempt to call her transformation back ending in the same hollow failure, like reaching for a light switch that was no longer wired to anything. The villain was long gone. She did not know if she had won or lost that fight. She only knew that something had been taken from her in the middle of it, some quiet mechanism that had always simply worked, and now it did not, and her draconic body was beginning to send her the kind of signals that made her oldest fear, the one she had managed for her entire career and never once spoken about publicly, rear up fully formed for the first time. She was going to die transformed. Not from injury. From cost. Her body did not have 11 hours of fuel in it. It had perhaps 3, on a good day, with full rest beforehand and a support team standing by with the kind of nutrient and fluid replacement that kept a sustained transformation from cannibalizing the body underneath it. She had none of that here. She had a parking structure that smelled like concrete dust, a transformation she could not release, and a heartbeat that had started, in just the last 20 minutes, to feel less like her own and more like something laboring. She tried to call for help. Her voice came out as something closer to a low resonant groan, the draconic vocal apparatus unsuited for human speech, and even if it had not been, she was 3 districts from where anyone would think to look, in a containment zone the police had already cleared and abandoned once the main threat seemed to have passed. She thought, with the strange detached clarity that sometimes arrived right before panic, that this was an absurd way for someone with her resume to die. Years of S-class missions. National recognition. A reputation built on being unshakable. And here she was, undone not by a villain's fist but by something far quieter, something that had simply reached into her and removed the part of her that let her choose her own shape. She had just enough strength left to drag herself further back into the collapsed structure, out of the wind, when she heard footsteps. She braced for the villain to have returned. Instead, a young man in a worn jacket climbed over the rubble at the structure's entrance, moving with the kind of careful, deliberate pace of someone assessing a scene before acting rather than someone rushing in blind. He stopped when he saw her, and she watched him take in the size of her, the obvious draconic distress in her posture, the rubble, the absence of any other rescue presence, and arrive at a series of conclusions in the span of about 2 seconds. "You're stuck in this form," he said. Not a question. "How long?" She managed another low sound, frustrated at her own inability to answer properly. "Okay. Okay, that's fine, I don't need you to talk." He was already moving closer, slow and unthreatening, hands visible, the posture of someone who had done this exact kind of approach many times before with frightened, injured people who could not easily communicate. "My name is Izuku Midoriya. I'm a rescue specialist, I work independently, and I think I might actually be able to help you, but I need you to let me get close enough to try something, and you need to understand what that something is before I do it. Can you give me a sign if you understand?" She inclined her massive head, the closest approximation of a nod her current shape allowed. "My quirk lets me bond with someone through contact and pull a portion of their physical strain into myself. I think whatever happened to you has disconnected your control over the transformation, but the transformation itself is still drawing on your body like normal, which means your body's running on a deficit it has no way to stop accumulating. I can't fix the disconnection. I don't know what's causing it and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I might be able to buy you time by taking on some of what your body's currently struggling to pay for. It'll hurt. I want to be honest about that before you agree to anything." She held very still, processing what he was offering. She had never heard of a quirk that worked quite this way. She had also, in 11 hours of mounting panic, run out of better options, and something in the steadiness of his voice, the fact that he had led with the cost rather than hiding it, told her this was not someone interested in taking advantage of a hero at her most vulnerable. She lowered her head toward him, the only consent she had the physical vocabulary left to offer. "Okay," he said, quiet. "Okay. Thank you for trusting me. This is going to feel strange before it feels better." He placed both hands against the scaled plate just beneath her jaw, the only part of her draconic body close enough to the ground for him to reach without climbing onto her, and closed his eyes. The first thing she felt was a kind of opening, as though a door deep inside her chest that had been straining under pressure had suddenly found a second exit. The exhaustion did not vanish. She could still feel the deficit, the laboring heartbeat, the slow grinding cost of 11 unbudgeted hours. But it stopped accelerating. Something on the other end of that open door was taking a portion of the weight, and she watched, through eyes that suddenly had the clarity to actually watch, as the young man in front of her went pale and his knees buckled slightly, his own breathing turning ragged in a way that mirrored, faintly, what hers had been doing moments before. He did not let go. "There," he said, through visibly gritted teeth. "There, that's better, that's more sustainable. I can't hold all of it, your body's working too hard for that, but I can hold enough to slow it down. We need to get you somewhere with medical support, and we need to do it now, while this buys us time." She wanted to ask him why. Why a stranger would walk into a collapsed parking structure and willingly take on a fraction of the same lethal exhaustion currently working through her body, for no compensation, no agency contract, no camera anywhere in sight to record the act. She had no voice with which to ask, and he did not seem to expect one. "I'm going to need your help getting out of here," he said instead. "I can't carry you, you're a little larger than that. But if you can move, even slowly, I can keep doing this the entire way, and it should make the difference between collapsing in the next 10 minutes and making it somewhere safe." She moved. It took every scrap of will she had left, dragging her enormous, failing body out from the rubble, through the wrecked containment zone, toward the lights of the city beyond, with this stranger's hands never once leaving her scales, his own steps growing visibly less steady with every minute that passed, and still he did not let go, and still he did not ask her for anything in return beyond the simple act of continuing to move. Chapter 4. The walk out of the containment zone took 40 minutes that felt, to Izuku, like several lifetimes stitched together end to end. He had bonded with people before under difficult circumstances. He had carried the exhaustion of trapped construction workers, of hikers stranded for days, of a teenager who had nearly drowned and whose body had spent its panic faster than its strength could replace. None of it had prepared him for what it meant to hold a fraction of the cost of a transformation this large, sustained for this long, in a body that was actively and uncontrollably continuing to burn through its own reserves with no way to stop. By the time the city lights came into proper view, his legs had started shaking in a way he recognized as the early edge of his own limit, the place his body began sending warnings before it actually failed. He had learned, over years of pushing against that edge in service of other people, exactly how much further he could go past the first warning before the second one arrived, the one that did not give him any more choices. He did not let go of Ryukyu's scales until the moment paramedics physically separated his hands from her, an act that took 2 of them in several seconds because his fingers had locked into place from the sustained effort of holding the bond steady. "Sir, you need to sit down," one of them said, and he realized distantly that he was swaying. "She needs continuous fluid and nutrient support," he said instead, the words coming out thick. "Her transformation is locked, she can't release it, I don't know why, but her body's running a deficit that's been compounding for at least 11 hours. I bought some time by absorbing part of the load, but it's going to come back the second I'm not in contact anymore. You need to treat her like she's mid-emergency, not post-emergency." The paramedic looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to trust a stranger's diagnosis over their own training, and then looked past him at Ryukyu's enormous, visibly laboring form, and made the call to believe him. Izuku sat down on the curb because his body finally insisted on it, watching through swimming vision as the paramedics worked, as more emergency vehicles arrived, as someone finally located a specialist who dealt with transformation-type medical emergencies and began directing a treatment plan that matched almost exactly what he had described. He stayed until they loaded her into the largest transport vehicle the hospital had, the kind built for heroes whose forms did not fit standard ambulances, and he stayed afterward too, sitting on that same curb with a paramedic periodically checking on him because his own vitals had dipped further than anyone standing nearby was comfortable with. "You're the rescue guy," the paramedic said eventually, not really a question. "The one the detectives talk about. Didn't expect you'd be built like this." "Built like what?" "Like someone who looks like he hasn't eaten today, helping a national-ranked hero who outweighs a delivery truck." There was no malice in it, just tired curiosity. "Most people in your line of work specialize in finding people, not in this." "My quirk happens to be useful for both," Izuku said, and left it there, because explaining the whole shape of Pac Bond to a stranger on a curb at 2 in the morning felt like more honesty than either of them had energy for. He did not see Ryukyu again for 4 days, not because he had no interest in checking on her, but because the hospital staff treating a hero of her profile were understandably cautious about an unaffiliated independent rescue worker showing up to ask questions, and he respected that caution enough not to push against it. He spent those 4 days the way he spent most days that followed a difficult case, filing his own report with the detective who had given him Ryukyu's case originally, following up on the slow trickle of forensic information about whatever had locked her transformation in place, and adding detail to a working theory that he did not like at all. The detective called him on the 4th day with confirmation. "Same signature as the others," she said. "Whatever attacked her, it didn't try to kill her in the conventional sense. The working theory from the specialists is that something interfered directly with the neurological mechanism that lets her control the transformation, essentially locking the switch in the on position. We're calling it a harvesting pattern, because in every other confirmed case, something was missing afterward that wasn't missing before." "Missing how?" "We don't fully understand it yet. The petrification case I showed you, the one who's still essentially comatose inside stone, his medical team thinks something about the quirk itself feels diminished, like part of its underlying capacity was siphoned off even though the quirk itself is technically intact. We don't have the vocabulary for it because nobody's built a framework for a quirk that does this to other quirks." She paused. "Ryukyu got lucky. You got to her before whatever this is finished, whatever it does to its targets. The others weren't so lucky." Izuku absorbed that in silence for a long moment. "She's not going to feel lucky," he said finally. "She's going to feel like something was taken from her even if the doctors can't measure what. Probably. You'd know better than me how that sort of thing feels." Her voice carried a question she did not ask outright, about exactly how he had known to treat a transformation lock as an active emergency requiring sustained physical contact, about exactly how a man with no agency and no public profile had ended up standing in a collapsed parking structure holding a national hero's exhaustion in his own body for 40 straight minutes. She did not ask it. He appreciated that more than he said. He visited Ryukyu on the 5th day, once her medical team confirmed she was stable enough for a single visitor and had specifically requested to see the man who had pulled her out. She was sitting upright when he arrived, human again, smaller than her draconic form but somehow not smaller as a presence, her eyes tracking him across the room with an intensity that made him understand, immediately and without needing to be told, that this was a woman who had spent her entire adult life being underestimated and had developed a very precise way of looking at people to compensate. "You're younger than I expected," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "The detectives described you like you'd been doing this for 20 years. I've been doing it for 7. Started young." He stayed near the door, giving her space, reading the room the way he always did before deciding how close to stand. "How are you feeling?" "Like something tried to take my body away from me and almost succeeded." She said it plainly, without flinching, the way someone says a fact they have already made peace with examining directly. "The doctors keep telling me I'm lucky. I keep waiting to feel lucky instead of just emptied out." "That makes sense to me," Izuku said. "I wouldn't expect you to feel lucky yet. You went through something most people don't have a framework for surviving." She studied him for a long moment, something in her expression shifting, recalculating. "Most people who rescue a hero want something from it. A photo. A connection to my agency. Some kind of leverage." Her eyes did not leave his face. You held on to me for 40 minutes carrying a fraction of what was killing me, and the detectives tell me you walked away afterward without even giving them your agency information, because you don't have an agency. I don't need anything from you, he said simply. I went looking because 3 names in a notebook of mine kept getting quietly hurt by something nobody else was tracking, and you were the first name something actually happened to. That's the whole reason. There's no second reason underneath it. There's always a second reason. But she said it without real suspicion, more like she was testing whether he would crack under the observation, the way she likely tested everyone who claimed to want nothing from her. When he simply held her gaze, calm and unbothered, something in her posture eased, fractionally, the wariness of a woman accustomed to being approached for her usefulness recalibrating in real time around a person who apparently was not doing that. I do have one thing I'd like to ask you, eventually, he admitted. Not today. You're still recovering. But I've been trying to build something for a long time, something for people like you who carry an extra cost every single day that the rest of the hero industry doesn't think about. I don't have it built yet. I don't even fully know what it looks like. But when you're ready, if you ever want to hear what I'm trying to make, I'd like to tell you about it. Ryukyu was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the same intensity she had carried since he walked in, and then, for the first time since he had arrived, something that might have been the early shape of a smile crossed her face. You held a piece of my dying body for 40 minutes and didn't ask for anything, she said. I think I can spare the time to listen to whatever you're building. Come back when I'm out of this bed. I want to hear the whole thing, not the bedside version. It was not loyalty. It was not anything close to that, not yet. But it was the first thread of something that had not existed an hour ago, and Izuku walked out of that hospital room feeling, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, like the shape of the thing he wanted to build had just become very slightly more real. Chapter 5. 3 weeks later, Ryukyu walked into the small noodle shop Izuku had suggested, the kind of place with no agency logos on the walls and no chance of being recognized by anyone with a camera, and slid into the booth across from him with the same direct, evaluating look she had given him in the hospital. I want the whole thing, she said, before he had even finished pouring her tea. Not the polite version you'd give a stranger. The real one. So he told her. He told her about the notebook, the 3 names, the years of underground work that had taught him exactly how invisible certain kinds of heroes became to the official system the moment they stopped being convenient. He told her about the support Quirk literature that had made his skin crawl as a teenager, the language of stabilizing and anchoring that treated a person's own body like a liability to be managed by someone else. He told her, with more honesty than he had given anyone in years, about wanting to build a place that did not yet have a name, somewhere a hero whose quirk cost her every single day could come down off that cost without having to perform recovery for an agency's publicity calendar. I don't want followers, he said. I don't want a roster of people whose loyalty I've engineered. I've thought about that distinction more than I've thought about almost anything else in my life, because I know exactly how easy it would be to build something that looked like care and was actually just control with better branding. I'm not interested in that. I want people who choose to stay because the place is actually good for them, and who are free to leave the second it stops being good for them, and I would rather it stay small and honest than grow big and hollow. Ryukyu listened without interrupting, her tea going cold in front of her, and when he finished she sat back against the booth and exhaled slowly. Do you know how rare that is, she said. Not the dream. Plenty of people have dreams like that. The part where you've already thought through every way it could curdle into something controlling, before you've even built it. She studied him. Most people don't examine their own ambitions that closely until after they've already hurt someone with them. I've watched what happens when support-type quirks get treated as tools, Izuku said. I grew up being told my own quirk made me built for exactly that role. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to do to anyone else what almost got done to me. Something shifted fully in Ryukyu's expression then, the last guarded edge of her posture finally settling. I'm in, she said simply. Not as some grand declaration. I'm not going to retire from my agency tomorrow and move into whatever building you eventually find. But I want to be part of building this. I want to help you figure out what it actually looks like, because I think you're right that it doesn't exist yet, and I think I've spent my entire career wishing it did. It was, Izuku would think later, the first real cornerstone of everything that came after. Not a rescue. Not a debt repaid. A choice, made freely, by a woman who had weighed exactly what she was agreeing to and decided it was worth her time. They spent the rest of that evening sketching the outline of something that did not yet have walls, a place with real medical infrastructure built around transformation type and beast type quirks specifically, staffed by people who understood the particular exhaustion of living inside an extraordinary body, run without the performance demands of a standard hero agency. Ryukyu, with her contacts and her decade of professional standing, began quietly asking around about available properties outside the city, places large enough and remote enough to give a sustained transformation room to exist without frightening the neighbors. It was during one of those property searches, 2 months later, that the second name in Izuku's notebook found him instead of the other way around, in a manner considerably more violent than either of them would have chosen. He got the call at 4 a.m. A detective's voice, tight with the specific urgency reserved for situations that were actively unfolding rather than already resolved. Midoriya. I need you near the Eastern Industrial Corridor right now, and I need you to know going in that this is bad. Mirko's down there fighting something nobody else has been able to identify, and 3 responding units already turned back because whatever this thing is, it's not behaving like anything in our database. Izuku was already moving before the detective finished the sentence, pulling on his jacket with one hand while reaching for his boots with the other. Is it the same signature? He said. The harvesting pattern. We don't know yet. But Midoriya, listen to me. If it is the same thing that got to Ryukyu, you cannot do whatever you did for her in the middle of an active fight. You'll get yourself killed standing still trying to absorb someone's strain while a villain we don't understand is still swinging. I know, Izuku said, already out the door. I'm not planning to stand still. He had spent 2 months since the Ryukyu case quietly studying everything available about Mirko's public fighting record, not out of professional curiosity but because her name sat second in his notebook and he had wanted, for longer than he would have admitted to anyone, to understand the woman before circumstances forced an introduction. He knew she fought reckless and alone by choice, that she treated backup as an insult rather than a resource, that her joints and tendons paid a price every time she pushed her rabbit-type quirk past its safe operating range, a price she had been quietly absorbing for years through sheer force of will rather than any kind of medical management. He knew, riding toward the industrial corridor at the fastest speed his motorcycle could manage, that whatever he found there was not going to be solved by gentle words and an open hand. Mirko did not respond to that kind of approach. She would need something else from him entirely, and he was not yet certain he had it. Chapter 6. Mirko had been losing this fight for the last 10 minutes and refused, on principle, to admit it. The thing she was fighting did not look like much. A man, unremarkable in build, moving with an economy of motion that should have made him easy to read and somehow did not, because every time she committed to a strike that should have ended the exchange, he was simply not where the strike landed anymore. And her overextended kick or punch sailed through empty air while something in her own body screamed at the wasted force. She had broken 3 of his ribs in the opening exchange. She was almost certain of that. And yet he kept moving like the injury had not registered, like pain was a message his body had simply declined to receive, and twice now during the fight she had felt something pull at her from a distance, a strange tugging sensation low in her gut that had nothing to do with any blow he had actually landed, as though he were reaching into her from several feet away and testing the seams of something she could not see. What are you? She snarled, circling him, her breath coming hard, her legs already past the point where she should have called this fight and pulled back to recover. She never pulled back to recover. It was not in her vocabulary. The man did not answer with words. He answered by raising one hand, palm out, and the strange tugging sensation intensified all at once, a pulling so sharp and sudden that her vision actually flickered at the edges, her rabbit-type quirk suddenly feeling less like an extension of her body and more like something being yanked at from outside it. She had felt exhaustion before. She had felt her joints scream from pushing her quirk's output past its design limits more times than she could count. This was different. This felt like theft. You should not be this difficult, the man said, and his voice carried no particular malice, only a kind of clinical disappointment, as though she were a stubborn lock refusing a key that should have fit. The others did not resist this long. The others, she repeated, and something cold settled into the fury already burning through her. How many? Enough, he said, and pulled again, harder, and this time her knees actually buckled, her body folding under a strain that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with whatever was happening to the quirk itself, deep beneath the skin, in whatever part of her made the rabbit form possible at all. She did not see Izuku arrive. She heard him instead, a voice cutting through the ringing in her ears with a clarity that suggested he had assessed the entire scene in the half-second since he'd come around the corner. "Don't pull again," Izuku said, and the man turned, mildly curious, toward the new arrival rather than alarmed, the posture of someone who did not yet consider this an actual threat. "Whatever you're doing to her, it's not going to work the same way twice if I'm standing here." "And why is that?" the man said. "Because I'm about to give her something to push back with, and you don't strike me as the type who's tested what happens when your harvesting meets resistance instead of exhaustion." It was, Izuku would admit to himself later, mostly bluff. He had never tested Pac Bond against whatever this man's quirk actually did. He had no idea if sharing his own stamina with Mirko mid-harvest would do anything except give the man more to take. But he had learned, over years of underground rescue work, that confidence delivered at exactly the right moment could buy several crucial seconds even when it was built on nothing more than hope, and several seconds was sometimes the entire margin between a life saved and a life lost. The man studied him for a moment, recalculating, the way someone recalculates when an equation suddenly contains an unfamiliar variable. "You're the one who pulled the dragon out," he said, and something in his tone shifted, interest replacing the earlier clinical disappointment. "I wondered if you would eventually become a problem." "I'd rather just be a person who gets in your way," Izuku said, already moving toward Mirko, who was on one knee now, her breathing ragged, her eyes tracking him with a wariness that had nothing to do with fear of him specifically and everything to do with a lifetime of distrusting anyone who showed up offering help mid-fight. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to get her out." "Don't," Mirko said, low and furious, even as her body visibly betrayed how little fight she had left in it. "I don't need rescuing. I don't need some nobody showing up to. You can be furious with me about it after we're both still alive to argue," Izuku said, kneeling beside her despite the obvious risk of staying this close to a man who had already proven he could reach into a person from several feet away. "I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm asking you to let me touch your arm for exactly as long as it takes to get you moving, and you can yell at me the entire way if it makes this easier." She did not answer. She also did not pull away when his hand closed around her forearm, and the moment the bond formed, both of them felt it at once, a strange, immediate resistance running through the connection, as though Pac Bond itself recognized something in the harvesting pull and was actively pushing back against it without Izuku consciously directing the effort. The man's eyes narrowed. "Interesting," he said, and took a single step forward, testing. "I wouldn't," Izuku said, and meant it this time, because he could feel something building through the bond, not strength exactly, but a kind of stubborn anchoring, Mirko's exhausted quirk suddenly less like a thread being pulled loose and more like a thread someone else was holding the other end of. He did not fully understand the mechanism. He understood, with absolute clarity, that it was working. The man did not press the advantage. Instead he tilted his head, assessing, and after a long moment he simply turned and walked into the dark beyond the streetlights, unhurried, the posture of someone choosing to withdraw from a calculation rather than someone retreating from a threat. "Another time," he said, without looking back. "I am patient. I have been collecting for a long time, and I intend to keep collecting for considerably longer." Mirko tried to lunge after him and made it exactly 4 inches before her legs gave out entirely, and Izuku caught her before she hit the pavement, the bond between them still holding, still anchoring whatever had nearly been torn loose. "Let go of me," she said, though there was no real force behind it, her voice thick with exhaustion and something raw underneath. "In a minute," Izuku said. "Your body's still running on fumes and I'm not letting go until I know you're stable. You can hate me about it once we're somewhere safe." "I don't hate you," she muttered, the fight finally draining out of her voice along with the last of her strength. "I just don't know what to do with someone who shows up and actually means it." Chapter 7. Mirko did not handle recovery gracefully, and she did not pretend otherwise. She spent the first 2 days in a private clinic Ryukyu had quietly arranged, the kind with no press presence and no public registry of patients, complaining loudly and constantly to anyone within earshot about the indignity of needing a clinic in the first place, about the absurdity of her joints requiring rest, about how she had been managing her own body just fine for years before some underground rescue specialist decided she needed managing. Izuku visited on the third day, mostly because Ryukyu told him directly that showing up was the right move even though every instinct he had said to give Mirko more space. She'll respect you more for showing up while she's still angry than for waiting until she's calm, Ryukyu had told him over the phone. Trust me on this one. I've fought beside her for years. He found Mirko sitting upright in bed, arms crossed, glaring at the door the moment it opened as though she had been waiting specifically to glare at whoever walked through it. You, she said. Come to check on your investment? Came to see how you're doing, Izuku said, staying near the door, the same careful read-the-room instinct he had used with Ryukyu. I can leave if that's not welcome. Didn't say leave. She studied him with narrowed eyes, the same evaluating intensity Ryukyu had shown him in the hospital, though where Ryukyu's version had been quiet and measured, Mirko's came wrapped in barely restrained irritation. Sit down. You're making the room feel smaller, hovering like that. He sat. I looked into you, she said, without preamble. After. Asked around. Detectives know you. Some of the underground network knows you. Nobody seems to know much beyond the fact that you find people other heroes give up on and you don't charge for it. That's mostly accurate. Why? It was the same question the detective had asked him months ago, and he gave Mirko a more complete answer than he had given anyone, because something about her directness seemed to demand it. Because I spent my whole childhood being told my quirk made me built to support someone else's career instead of having one of my own, he said. Because the hero industry treats people with quirks like yours and Ryukyu's like spectacle when you're winning and inconvenience when you're tired, and almost nobody builds anything to actually account for what your bodies go through. I'm trying to build that. Somewhere people don't have to keep proving they deserve rest. Mirko was quiet for a long moment, the irritation in her expression settling into something more careful. I don't do well in places that ask me to slow down, she said finally. I've spent my whole career outrunning anyone who tried to tell me my body had limits. If this place you're building is some kind of soft retirement home dressed up as a sanctuary, I'm not interested. It's not that, Izuku said. I'm not interested in slowing anyone down who doesn't want to slow down. I'm interested in making sure the cost of pushing as hard as you want to push doesn't quietly kill you because nobody built proper infrastructure around it. You can fight exactly as hard and as recklessly as you want. I just want there to be somewhere real to land afterward, instead of an empty apartment and a body running on willpower alone. Something in Mirko's face shifted, the wariness cracking just slightly. That man, she said, changing direction entirely. The one who did this. You called him by something, before. You knew what he was. I have a working theory. 3 names in a notebook, all heroes with beast type or transformation quirks, all targeted the same way over the last year. I've started calling him the Harvester, mostly because nobody else has given him a better name and the detectives need something to put in a file. Izuku's jaw tightened. He's done this before. He'll do it again. You're the second person I pulled out of it, not the first. And the third name in your notebook, Mirko said. You planning to wait for her to almost die too, or are you going to actually warn her first? It was a fair question, and it landed harder than Izuku expected. I don't know who she is yet, he admitted. I've narrowed it down through pattern of public appearances getting shorter and more erratic, but I don't have a name confirmed. I've been trying to find her before he does. I haven't managed it yet. Mirko studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, the irritation finally draining out of her posture entirely. Earthquake type, she said. Works the wild Pussycat's territory, mostly perimeter and search and rescue. Goes by Pixie-Bob professionally. She watched his face change as the pieces clicked together. I've crossed paths with her a handful of times. She's been pushing herself ragged for months covering for 2 teammates on leave. If your harvester likes targets who are isolated and overextended, she's exactly the profile. It was, Izuku realized, the first piece of real intelligence anyone had handed him in this entire search, freely given by a woman who 2 days ago had been furious at him for saving her life. Thank you, he said, meaning it completely. Don't thank me yet. Go warn her, and then come back and tell me whether your sanctuary idea has an actual building yet, because Ryukyu's been talking my ear off about property listings and I want to see the place before I decide if I'm staying anywhere near it. A faint, sharp edge of a smile crossed her face, the first one he had seen from her. And don't get any ideas about this meaning I'm grateful. I'm interested. That's a different thing. I'll take interested, Izuku said. I'm not in the business of demanding gratitude. Good. Because I don't have much of it in me. She settled back against the pillows, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders. Go find Pixie-Bob before that thing does. I mean it. I don't want a third name added to whatever's keeping you up at night. He left the clinic that evening with a name, a location, and a deadline he could feel tightening around him with every day that passed. The comfortable 2-month stretch he had spent slowly building something with Ryukyu now replaced by the much sharper awareness that the harvester was not finished, and that somewhere across the city, a woman running herself into the ground covering for absent teammates had no idea how little time she might have left before he found her first. Chapter 8. Pixie-Bob's agency listed her last public patrol 3 days before Izuku and Mirko arrived at the wild Pussycat's territory, and the gap itself told him most of what he needed to know before he had even spoken to anyone. 3 days is too long for someone who reports in daily, Mirko said, pacing the edge of the territory's outer fence line, her earlier reluctance to be anywhere near a hospital long since burned off into the restless energy that seemed to be her default state once she'd recovered. I checked her patrol logs going back 2 months before I came to find you in that clinic. She'd been covering this entire perimeter solo, every single day, no relief. Why didn't her agency flag it sooner? Because she kept filing reports. Short ones, but they came in on schedule, right up until they didn't. Mirko's jaw tightened. Pussycats are a small outfit. 2 of the senior members went on medical leave 8 weeks back, and from what I can tell, nobody above Pixie-Bob's pay grade thought to ask how one person was supposed to absorb an entire team's coverage without it costing her something. Izuku had spent the drive out reviewing everything he could find on her Quirk, the kind of methodical preparation that had become reflexive over years of underground work. Pixie-Bob's earth manipulation ability let her reshape terrain on a scale most heroes could only dream of, raising walls, opening trenches, redirecting entire sections of ground to contain a threat or shield civilians. It was an extraordinary quirk, and like every extraordinary quirk he had studied since Ryukyu's case, it came with a cost nobody outside her own body had ever fully measured, a depletion that built cumulatively the more she used it in a short window, the kind of fatigue that did not fully clear with a single night's sleep if the pace never let up long enough for real recovery. If the harvester's pattern holds, Izuku said, he doesn't target heroes who are well rested and well supported. He targets the ones running on empty, the ones nobody's watching closely enough to notice when they go quiet. Which describes every single day of her last 2 months. They found the abandoned substation 40 minutes later, on the far edge of the territory where Pixie-Bob's last logged patrol had ended, a squat concrete building that had not seen active use in years but still showed, around its perimeter, the unmistakable scarring of recent ground manipulation, long furrows in the earth, raised barriers half collapsed, the unmistakable signature of someone who had fought here and fought hard. She made a stand, Mirko said quietly, crouching by one of the furrows. Tried to box something in. Look at the angle of these walls, she was trying to contain whatever she was fighting, not just defend herself. Izuku followed the scarring toward the substation's entrance, where the door hung open on a single remaining hinge, and felt the same metallic, faintly warm air he remembered from the warehouse where he'd found the courier months ago, the unmistakable signature of a space someone had occupied for far too long. Stay behind me, he said, and Mirko, for once, did not argue, though the tension in her posture made clear it cost her something to hold back. Pixie-Bob was inside, slumped against the curved wall of what had once been a transformer housing, and the moment Izuku saw her, his earlier theory about partial harvesting stopped being a theory. She was conscious, barely, her eyes tracking him with the dull unfocus of someone running on fumes far past the point exhaustion alone could explain. The ground around her told its own story, cracked and uneven in patches that did not match any natural geological process, as though something had been drawn directly out of the earth beneath her feet in fits and starts, her own quirk signature bleeding faintly into the concrete in patterns that made no sense for an ability meant to stay contained inside a person's body. She's still being drained, Izuku said, low, moving carefully toward her. Active, not locked like Ryukyu's was. Whatever he did, it's still pulling, slowly, even with him gone. How is that possible? Mirko said, crouching at the entrance, scanning the dark beyond it for any sign the harvester himself might still be near. I don't know yet. I don't think anyone does. Izuku knelt beside Pixie-Bob, keeping his movements slow, his hands visible the way he always did with someone too disoriented to fully track a stranger's intentions. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I'm not with your agency, but I know what's happening to you, or at least I know enough to try to help. Can you hear me? Her eyes found his, and something in them, beneath the exhaustion, sharpened with the specific alertness of someone whose entire profession had trained her to be suspicious of strangers offering help at the worst possible moment. Who sent you? She said, the words slurred but coherent. Nobody sent me. A detective gave me your case 3 weeks ago. Mirko gave me your name and your last patrol route 2 days ago. I've been trying to find you before whoever did this finished what he started. He kept his hands where she could see them. I have a quirk that might be able to slow down whatever's still pulling at you. I want to try it, but I need you to actually agree to it first, because the last thing either of us needs is you fighting me while I'm trying to help. She studied him for a long, swaying moment, her body listing slightly to one side before she caught herself. Everyone at my agency thinks I'm fine, she said, and there was something raw underneath the words, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. I kept telling them I had it covered. I kept telling myself I had it covered. You didn't have to have it covered alone, Izuku said. That's not a failure on your part. That's an agency that let one person absorb an entire team's workload without checking whether the cost was sustainable. We can talk about that later, when you're not actively bleeding out a quirk in real time. Right now I need your answer. She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had lost consciousness entirely, before she finally exhaled and gave the smallest possible nod. Do it, she said. Before I change my mind out of pride. He placed his palm against her forearm, and the moment the bond formed, he understood immediately why this case felt different from anything he had encountered before. Chapter 9. With Ryukyu, the bond had given him something stable to anchor against, a body laboring under a fixed deficit that simply needed time and support to stop compounding. With Mirko, mid-fight, the bond had pushed back against an active pull from outside, something his quirk seemed to recognize instinctively as an intrusion to resist. This was neither. This was a slow, steady leak, something embedded so deeply in whatever connected Pixie-Bob's mind to her quirk that it had kept draining for days after the man who caused it had walked away, like a wound that refused to close on its own. Through the bond, Izuku felt it directly, not a single violent pull, but a thin, patient siphon, drawing some small fraction of her quirk's underlying capacity away with every hour that passed, regardless of whether she was awake, asleep, resting, or fighting. This isn't like the others, he said, his voice tight with the effort of trying to understand what he was feeling well enough to actually counter it. This is still active. He did something that doesn't need him present to keep working. Can you stop it? Mirko said, kneeling on Pixie-Bob's other side now, having abandoned her watch at the entrance the moment she heard the strain in Izuku's voice. I don't know. I've never tried to counter something like this before. He closed his eyes, focusing past the unfamiliar mechanics of the leak itself, searching for whatever Pac Bond actually was doing at its core, the same instinct that had let him anchor against Mirko's harvesting attempt weeks ago. I think the bond can slow it. I don't think I can close it. Closing it might need something neither of us has yet. He held the connection anyway, because slowing it was infinitely better than letting it continue unchecked, and he felt Pixie-Bob's breathing steady almost immediately, the dull unfocus in her eyes sharpening as some of the constant drain eased. That's better, she murmured. That's so much better. What are you? Don't try to talk yet. Just breathe. He kept his hand steady against her arm, feeling his own reserves beginning to draw down faster than he expected, the cost of fighting a continuous leak proving steeper than the cost of absorbing a fixed deficit. Mirko, I need you to get her agency on the phone. Tell them where we are, Tell them she needs a transformation specialist immediately, the same kind that treated Ryukyu. And tell them I think whatever's draining her is still active, so whoever they send needs to come prepared for that, not just for standard exhaustion. Mirko was already moving, phone out, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to giving orders that got followed without question. It took 19 minutes for the first response team to arrive, the longest 19 minutes of Izuku's professional life, his own strength steadily eroding under the unfamiliar strain of holding back a leak he did not fully understand, his vision beginning to narrow at the edges in a way that told him, with the same clear internal alarm he had learned to recognize over years of pushing his limits, that he was approaching a threshold he could not safely cross. "You're going pale," Pixie-Bob said, her voice steadier now, her eyes tracking him with growing clarity even as her own body remained weak. "You need to let go. You're not actually fixing this, you're just bleeding for me instead of letting me bleed alone, and that's not a trade I asked you to make." "You did ask," Izuku said, through gritted teeth. "You said do it." "I'm doing it. I said do it because I didn't understand what it would cost you." There was real alarm in her voice now, cutting through her own exhaustion. "Mirko, tell him to stop, he's not going to be able to walk out of here if he keeps this up." "He's not going to listen to me," Mirko said, though there was an edge of genuine worry in her own voice now too, watching Izuku's hand begin to tremble against Pixie-Bob's arm. "Midoriya. The medics are 6 minutes out. You don't need to hold this the entire way, you need to still be conscious when they arrive." He heard her. He understood the logic of what she was saying. And he held on anyway, because 6 minutes of unchecked leak against a body this depleted felt like a risk he was not willing to take with someone else's life, even at the cost of his own legs slowly giving out beneath him. The medical team arrived with equipment Izuku recognized from Ryukyu's case, the kind of specialized transformation support gear that existed specifically because the harvester's pattern had finally forced the medical establishment to build a framework for injuries nobody had previously needed to treat. He felt hands pulling him back, separating his grip from Pixie-Bob's arm with the same careful, practiced motion the paramedics had used months earlier, and the moment the bond broke, the world tilted sharply and he found himself sitting hard on the cracked concrete floor, his vision swimming, Mirko's hands suddenly gripping his shoulders to keep him upright. "Stay with me," she said, low and fierce, nothing like the irritated stranger from the hospital weeks ago. "You absolute idiot, you held that for 19 minutes against something you didn't even understand." "Had to," he managed. "Couldn't just watch it drain her. You could have let go 5 minutes earlier and you know it." But there was no real anger in her voice, only the rough edge of someone who had just watched a person nearly collapse trying to protect someone else, and recognized something in that she had no easy framework for processing. "Just breathe. I've got you. For once in your life, let someone else hold the weight." He laughed, weak and breathless, at the echo of his own words turned back on him, and let his eyes close while the medical team worked, trusting, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that someone else would watch his back while he was too depleted to watch it himself. Chapter 10. Izuku woke in an unfamiliar bed with an 4-line in his arm and Mirko asleep in a chair pulled uncomfortably close beside him, her arms crossed, her chin dropped to her chest in the kind of exhausted half-sleep that came from refusing to actually leave. "You stayed," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he expected. She startled awake, blinking hard, and then scowled at him with an intensity that did not quite manage to cover the relief underneath it. "Don't sound so surprised. Someone had to make sure you didn't pull something idiotic the second you woke up, like trying to go check on Pixie-Bob before the doctors cleared you to stand." She studied his face, something easing slightly in her posture. "You scared me back there." "I don't scare easily. Don't make a habit of it." "I'll try," he said, and meant it, though they both understood it was not entirely a promise he could guarantee keeping, given the nature of the work. The clinic staff cleared him to walk 2 hours later, against, he suspected, their better judgment, and Mirko walked beside him down the hall to Pixie-Bob's room with the kind of proprietary watchfulness of someone who had appointed herself responsible for both of them without ever formally announcing it. Pixie-Bob was sitting up when they arrived, paler than Izuku remembered from the substation but alert now, her eyes tracking the two of them as they entered with a wariness that had not fully softened. "You're the idiot who almost collapsed holding my arm for 19 minutes, she said to Izuku, by way of greeting. That's an accurate description, yes. Doctors say the leak slowed down significantly since you intervened. Not stopped. Slowed. They're not sure if it'll fully close on its own or if it needs something else, and nobody seems to have any idea what that something else might be. She studied him with an intensity that reminded him, faintly, of how Ryukyu had looked at him in her own hospital room months ago, the calculation of someone deciding how much to trust a stranger who had already proven willing to bleed for her. Why did you do that? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. I had 3 names in a notebook, Izuku said. Yours was the 3rd. I'd been trying to find you for weeks before this happened, and I didn't move fast enough. I wasn't going to compound that by holding back once I actually found you. That's not really an answer to why, she pressed. Plenty of people would have called the medics and stepped back to wait. You didn't have to be the one holding the line yourself. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things people asked him in earnest. Because I think every person who carries an extraordinary cost in their own body deserves someone willing to carry part of it with them, even briefly, even imperfectly, he said. I've spent my whole life around the idea that support-type quirks like mine exist to be useful to someone else's career. I decided a long time ago that if that was true, I'd rather be useful to people the rest of the industry overlooks than to whoever the cameras already love. Pixie-Bob was quiet for a long moment, her wariness not gone but visibly recalibrating, the same way Ryukyu's had in that first conversation, the same way Mirko's had in the clinic weeks earlier. My agency hasn't called once since this happened, she said finally, quietly. 3 days unaccounted for, and the first people to actually find me weren't even affiliated with the Pussycats. That tells you something about how much they were actually watching. It tells me you were running yourself into the ground covering for people who weren't there, and nobody above you thought to ask if that was sustainable, Izuku said. I'm not going to pretend I know your agency's full situation. But I do know that's not how anyone should have to operate, and I know there's a version of this work that doesn't require it. The dynasty, Mirko said, with a faint, knowing edge in her voice. Go on, tell her. You told me the whole speech in that clinic. Might as well give her the same one. So he did, the same outline he had given Ryukyu over cold tea and Mirko over hospital sheets, the sanctuary that did not exist yet, the medical infrastructure built specifically around the cost of extraordinary quirks, the insistence that nobody would be asked to perform gratitude or loyalty they had not freely chosen to give. Pixie-Bob listened with the same intensity she had directed at every other part of the conversation, and when he finished, she sat back against her pillows with an expression that was harder to read than either Ryukyu's or Mirko's had been. I want to believe that's real, she said. I want to believe someone's actually building something like that instead of just talking about it. But I've spent my whole career watching agencies promise support and deliver exactly nothing once the camera stopped rolling. I'm not going to pretend your sincerity is enough to undo that on its own. It shouldn't be, Izuku said. You shouldn't trust me because I sound sincere. You should trust the place once it actually exists and you've seen how it actually treats the people in it. I'm not asking you to commit to anything today. I'm asking you to come see it once there's something to see, and decide for yourself. Something in Pixie-Bob's expression shifted then, not quite trust, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. Fine, she said. Once there's a building and not just a speech, I'll come look at it. That's all I'm promising right now. That's all I'm asking for, Izuku said, and meant it. Mirko, watching the exchange from her chair by the door, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the expression of someone who had already decided this was going to work out the way she wanted it to, and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Chapter 11. Ryukyu had insisted on hosting the first proper gathering, mostly because she was the only one of the 3 with a home large enough and private enough to host anything without risking exposure to the press, and partly, Izuku suspected, because she wanted to be the one setting the tone for how this particular group of people learned to exist around each other. He arrived early to help her prepare, which mostly meant standing in her kitchen feeling useless while she moved with brisk efficiency around a space clearly designed for someone who valued order. You're nervous, she observed, not looking up from the tea she was preparing. I don't know what I'm supposed to be, he admitted. I've talked to each of you separately. I don't know what happens when you're all in the same room and I'm not the only thing anchoring the conversation. What you're supposed to be is exactly what you've already been, Ryukyu said. Honest. Useless at flattery. Annoyingly principled about not wanting anything from any of us. It's worked so far. I don't see why a bigger room would change that. Mirko arrived next, loud before she was even through the door, already complaining about the drive, and Pixie-Bob arrived last, quiet and watchful, taking in the apartment with the careful assessment of someone still deciding how much of herself to bring into a new space. The first 20 minutes were, by any honest accounting, somewhat stilted. Ryukyu's measured formality sat awkwardly against Mirko's restless energy, and Pixie-Bob hovered at the edges of both, contributing little, watching everyone else with the particular wariness of someone who had been burned by groups before. It was Mirko, predictably, who broke the tension, though not through any particular grace. So are we just going to sit here being polite, she said, or is someone going to admit that all three of us got rescued by the same scrawny guy who apparently can't take a compliment without looking like he wants to disappear into the floor? Ryukyu's mouth twitched. I was trying to be diplomatic. Diplomatic is boring. I want to know what Pixie-Bob thought when she first saw him. Because I called him a nobody to his face and he didn't even flinch. Pixie-Bob, caught off guard, allowed herself the first real smile Izuku had seen from her. I thought he looked like he hadn't slept properly in about a year, and I was right, because he nearly passed out holding my arm for 20 minutes like that was a reasonable thing to do. He did the exact same thing for me, Ryukyu said, except his version of restraint was apparently holding a dying transformation for 40 minutes instead. Sounds like a pattern, Mirko said, grinning now, the earlier tension in the room finally beginning to dissolve into something looser. Should we be worried he's going to make a habit of nearly killing himself every time one of us is in trouble? Yes, all three women said, nearly in unison, which surprised even them enough to break into actual laughter, the first sound in the room that did not feel careful or measured. Izuku, sitting slightly apart from the conversation, felt something in his chest loosen at the sound, a tension he had not fully realized he was carrying until it eased. I'm allowed to defend myself, he said, mildly. No you're not, Mirko said, because you don't actually have a defense. You just keep doing the thing that nearly kills you and calling it reasonable. It's not reasonable, Ryukyu agreed. It's also exactly why all three of us are sitting in this room instead of somewhere worse. The conversation shifted from there, the three women trading observations about the work Izuku had described to each of them separately, comparing notes, building, almost without his direct input, a clearer shape of what the sanctuary might actually look like once it existed. Ryukyu spoke about property she'd been scouting outside the city, large enough for a draconic form to move freely, remote enough to avoid press attention. Mirko, despite her earlier insistence that she had no interest in anywhere that asked her to slow down, found herself unexpectedly engaged in a conversation about recovery infrastructure, arguing pointedly that any facility worth building needed real training space, not just medical beds, because heroes like her would never stay anywhere that treated rest as the only purpose of the place. Pixie-Bob, quieter than the other two but increasingly present as the evening wore on, raised practical questions about staffing, about what kind of medical specialists would actually understand transformation type and beast type physiology well enough to help, questions nobody else in the room had thought to ask yet. You're already building it, Izuku said at one point, watching the three of them debate the merits of a specific property Ryukyu had found, and I haven't said anything in 10 minutes. That's because you talk too much about the philosophy of the thing and not enough about the actual logistics, Mirko said, without looking up. Someone has to handle the part where it actually gets built. She's right, Ryukyu said. You're good at the why. We're better at the how, at least collectively. Let us help carry that part. It struck him, sitting in Ryukyu's apartment surrounded by three women who 2 months ago had been strangers and were now, somehow, mid-argument about training facility layouts on his behalf, that this was precisely the thing he had wanted without ever quite having the language to describe it. Not followers. Not people whose loyalty had been manufactured by anything he had done to them. Just people who had looked honestly at what he was trying to build, decided it was worth their time, and were now actively shaping it into something better than what he could have built alone. Thank you, he said, quietly enough that the conversation paused. For what? Pixie-Bob asked. For actually showing up to argue about training facilities instead of just telling me it sounded nice and walking away. He looked between the three of them. That's the part one was always more afraid of than any villain. Building something nobody actually wanted to help carry. The room went briefly quiet, the kind of quiet that came from everyone present recognizing something real underneath an otherwise casual evening, before Mirko, never one to let a moment sit too heavily for too long, broke it with her usual bluntness. Don't get sentimental on us, she said. We're doing this because the idea is good, not because we feel sorry for you. Keep that straight. Noted, Izuku said, smiling despite himself, and the conversation moved on, easier now, the four of them settling into something that did not yet have a name but had, undeniably, already begun. Chapter 12. The property Ryukyu had been quietly scouting for months turned out to be a decommissioned training compound in the hills 2 hours outside the city, originally built decades earlier for a hero course that had folded when its founder retired without a successor willing to take on the debt. It had sat empty long enough that the grounds had begun reclaiming themselves, ivy crawling up the sides of a main hall built from honest stone rather than the glass and steel favored by modern agencies, training fields gone to seed, a perimeter wall tall and thick enough to give a draconic transformation real room to move without frightening anyone beyond it. It's a wreck, Mirko said, standing in the overgrown central courtyard with her arms crossed, surveying the place with the critical eye of someone who had trained at facilities built specifically to look impressive on camera. No modern equipment. Half the roof on the east wing looks like it's one bad storm from caving in. It's structurally sound, Ryukyu said. I had an engineer friend assess it before I even brought it to you. The roof issue is cosmetic, not load-bearing. And the price reflects exactly how much of a wreck it looks like, which is the entire point. I like it, Pixie-Bob said, quietly, from where she stood near what had once been a training field, now overrun with wildflowers and loose earth that practically begged to be reshaped. Nobody's going to stumble onto this place by accident. And look at the ground. I could have an actual obstacle course built into this in a week, terrain that changes, that actually tests something instead of standing on a flat mat hoping for the best. Izuku walked the ground slowly, saying little, taking in the bones of the place the way he had once taken in a half-collapsed warehouse and seen, beneath the decay, a building that matched a pattern he was looking for. He could see the shape of what this place could become, a main hall converted into shared living quarters and a proper medical wing, the training fields restored under Pixie-Bob's eventual direction, the high perimeter wall giving Ryukyu room to transform without restriction for the first time in her career, a quiet remoteness that would let all of them exist without performing recovery for anyone watching. It needs a lot of work, he said finally. And I don't have anywhere close to the funds to do that work properly on my own. None of us asked you to fund it alone, Ryukyu said, with the particular firmness of someone who had already anticipated this exact objection. I've put aside savings from 15 years of S-class work that I've had no real use for beyond a steady professional reputation I never cared much about maintaining. Mirko has a comparable situation, whether she wants to admit it. I have money, Mirko said, with a shrug that did not quite manage to look as casual as she clearly intended. Never had anything worth spending it on. Wasn't going to say it first, but since she did, fine. I'm not letting pride get in the way of an actual good idea. I don't have anywhere near what either of them have, Pixie-Bob said, but I have time, and I have the kind of expertise this place actually needs if you want training grounds that work properly instead of just looking good in photographs. Izuku looked between the three of them, something tightening in his throat that had nothing to do with exertion. This isn't what I imagined when I started writing names in a notebook, he said quietly. I imagined years of slow, mostly solitary work. I didn't imagine 3 people deciding, this fast, that they wanted to actually build it with me. You imagined wrong, Mirko said, not unkindly. That's allowed. Most good plans go wrong in better directions than the ones you originally drew up. They signed the paperwork 11 days later, the 4 of them standing in a lawyer's office that had clearly never processed a property transfer quite like this one, the deed listing all 4 names jointly, a deliberate choice Izuku had insisted on against his own instinct to keep himself legally separate from anything that could later be misread as ownership over the others. I want it clear, on paper, that none of you belong to this place because of me, he had said, the night before they signed. I want it clear that you each have exactly as much claim to it as I do, so that if anything ever goes wrong, If I ever do something that makes any of you want to leave, there's no question about whether you're free to take your share and go. You think about leaving more than someone who's trying to build a permanent home should, Ryukyu had observed. I think about it because I never want any of you discovering, 10 years from now, that the foundation was less solid than it looked, he had answered, and none of them had argued with him further, though Pixie-Bob had looked at him for a long moment afterward with an expression he could not quite read, something between approval and a quiet, private recalculation of exactly how much trust this man might eventually earn. The compound did not yet have a name. They debated several over the following weeks, mostly during long evenings spent clearing debris and assessing what could be salvaged versus rebuilt, none of the proposed names quite fitting until Mirko, exhausted and covered in dust after a full day of hauling broken furniture out of the main hall, simply said it without much ceremony. Pac Hall, she said. Since apparently that's what we are now. Might as well call the place what it actually is. Nobody objected. It stuck. Chapter 13. The man who would eventually become known to police files only as the Harvester did not think of himself by that name, and would not have objected to it either, finding the question of what he was called considerably less interesting than the question of what he was accumulating. He kept his collection in a place no official record would ever locate, a private accounting of every transformation and beast-type ability he had successfully drawn from over the past year, each one represented in his own private ledger not by a name but by a precise measurement of capacity gained, the petrification case worth a certain density of stillness, an early avian-type capture worth a certain lift in his own physical frame, each acquisition adding incrementally to a body that had started, 14 months ago, as nothing more than an unremarkable quirk for redirecting kinetic force, and had since become something considerably stranger. He had not expected the dragon to survive. He had miscalculated the timeline on that one, assumed her body's deficit would compound faster than it had, and the unexpected intervention that pulled her out before he could complete the harvest represented the first real anomaly in an otherwise smoothly executing plan. He had filed it away as curious rather than alarming, the kind of statistical outlier that happened occasionally in any sufficiently large sample. The rabbit had been a more direct test, and the resistance he had felt through that strange bonded connection had told him something worth taking seriously. The young man interfering with his work possessed a quirk that did not merely treat symptoms, the way medical intervention usually did, but actively pushed back against the harvesting mechanism itself, as though Pac Bond and his own ability operated on some adjacent frequency that allowed direct interference in a way nothing else he had encountered managed. He found that genuinely interesting. He had spent 14 months collecting capacity from people who could not meaningfully resist what he was doing to them, and the appearance of someone whose own quirk seemed built, almost mockingly, to counter his exactly the way a particular key counters a particular lock, struck him as either an extraordinary coincidence or something considerably more deliberate that he did not yet understand. The Earth quirk case had been a calculated risk, taken specifically because he suspected, correctly, that the young man would eventually locate her, and he had wanted to observe more closely what happened when his harvesting met direct interference over an extended period rather than a single brief confrontation. The slow leak he had embedded in her had been designed precisely to test the limits of whatever Pac Bond could actually do. Could it merely slow an active harvest, or could it close one entirely? The fact that it had only slowed, not closed, told him his current understanding of his own ability still held an advantage, however narrow. He had also, in the months since, begun hearing quiet rumors through the same underground channels he used to identify isolated targets, rumors of a compound being restored outside the city, of 3 prominent beast and transformation-type heroes apparently working in concert with the same independent rescue specialist who had interfered with 2 of his harvests directly. He found this development considerably more significant than either individual rescue had been. A man working alone, however effective, remained a manageable variable. A man building something deliberate, gathering capability and loyalty around a clear purpose, represented an entirely different category of problem, one his own collection, however extensive, had not specifically prepared him to counter. He considered, turning the matter over with the same patient, clinical attention he gave every calculation, whether to escalate his pace before this gathering compound became fully operational, or whether to wait, observe, and learn more about exactly what Pac Bond was capable of before committing to a confrontation that might cost him capacity he had spent over a year accumulating. He decided, in the end, on patience. He had built his entire collection through patience, choosing targets carefully, isolating them before they understood they were targets at all, harvesting slowly enough that the broader hero establishment had taken the better part of a year to even recognize a pattern existed. He did not intend to abandon that discipline now, simply because a single inconvenient variable had appeared in his otherwise reliable equation. But he made a note, in the private ledger no official record would ever find, to begin paying closer attention to the compound being restored in the hills outside the city, and to the 4 names now quietly associated with it. He was not in any hurry. He had been collecting for a long time, and he intended to keep collecting for considerably longer, and if the young man calling himself a rescue specialist intended to keep building something to stand in his way, he would simply have to learn, the way every other obstacle eventually had, exactly how much patience the harvester was willing to spend to take it apart. Chapter 14. The first month at Pac Hall taught Izuku more about each of them than the entire 2 months that had preceded it, because crisis revealed character in flashes, while the slow grind of actual renovation revealed it in patterns. Ryukyu, he learned, worked best with clear structure and grew visibly more settled the more organized their days became, drafting schedules nobody had asked her to draft and quietly absorbing the role of someone who kept the larger project from drifting. She also, he discovered during a long evening spent clearing the East Wing's damaged roof, carried a dry, understated humor she rarely showed anyone outside her closest circle, delivered so flatly that Mirko had once missed an entire joke and spent 10 minutes confused about why Pixie-Bob was laughing. You should let people see that more, Izuku told her one evening, the 2 of them sitting on the low wall outside the main hall after a long day of work, watching the sun go down over fields. Pixie-Bob had already started reshaping into something resembling proper training terrain. See what? The humor. The version of you that isn't performing competence for an audience. He said it carefully, aware that he was treading into territory that mattered to her. You don't have to be the measured, serious one here. Nobody's grading you on professionalism. She was quiet for a long moment, considering that. I've spent 15 years being the reliable one, she said finally. The one agencies could count on not to embarrass them, not to need anything extra, not to cause problems. I don't entirely know how to be anything else, even somewhere that's supposedly safe to try. You don't have to know yet, Izuku said. You just have to know it's allowed, whenever you're ready. Something in her posture eased, fractionally, the way it had in the hospital months earlier, the slow accumulation of a trust that had no single dramatic moment behind it, only a steady pattern of small honesties that kept proving themselves true. Mirko, by contrast, made her adjustment to Pac Hall loudly and without much subtlety, throwing herself into the physical labor of renovation with the same reckless intensity she brought to every fight, hauling debris far past the point her body strictly needed to, until Izuku finally caught her one afternoon sitting against a wall, breathing hard, her hands visibly shaking from overexertion. Don't, she said, before he had even opened his mouth. I know what you're about to say. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to sit down next to you. He did exactly that, settling onto the ground beside her, not touching, simply present. You don't have to prove you belong here by working yourself into the ground. Nobody's measuring your worth by how much debris you can haul in a day. I don't know how to exist somewhere without earning it, she admitted, quieter than he had ever heard her. Every place I've ever been, I had to prove I deserved to stay. Hero work, rankings, all of it. You stop proving yourself for 1 second and people decide you're replaceable. You're not replaceable here, Izuku said. Not because of what you can lift or how hard you can fight. Because you're the one who actually says the things the rest of us are too careful to say out loud, and this place would be quieter and worse without that. He paused. You earned your place the day you walked into Ryukyu's apartment and broke the tension in the room just by being honest. You don't need to haul anything to prove that again. Mirko did not answer immediately, staring out at the half-restored training field, something working behind her expression that she clearly was not ready to name aloud. Eventually she nudged his shoulder with hers, rough and brief, the closest thing to an acknowledgement she seemed willing to offer in that moment, and they sat together in silence until her hand stopped shaking. Pixie-Bob's adjustment looked different from either of the others, quieter, more private, conducted mostly through the training field she spent every spare hour reshaping into something increasingly elaborate, trenches, and rises and shifting terrain that nobody else fully understood the purpose of until she finally explained it one evening over dinner. It's not just for training, she said, when Mirko asked, not unkindly, why she kept changing the layout every few days instead of settling on a final design. I'm testing how long I can sustain shaping the ground before the fatigue sets in, then resting, then testing again. I'm trying to find my actual sustainable limit instead of just pushing until I collapse, the way I used to. The table went quiet for a moment, the weight of what she was describing settling over all of them. That's the first time, Izuku said carefully, that I've heard you talk about your limit like it's something worth knowing instead of something to push past. I almost died because I never learned where my actual limit was, Pixie-Bob said, matter of fact, no self-pity in it, simply an honest accounting of what had nearly happened to her. I figure if I'm going to keep doing this work, I should probably know the answer before the next crisis forces me to find out the hard way. That's the smartest thing any of us have said since we got here, Ryukyu said, and meant it, and the conversation moved on, but Izuku noticed, over the following weeks, that Pixie-Bob began sharing her findings with the others without being asked, mapping not just her own limits but quietly suggesting they each do the same, until monitoring their actual sustainable thresholds became, almost without anyone formally deciding it should, one of Pac Hall's unspoken founding principles. He found himself, more nights than not, simply watching the three of them from a slight distance, marveling at how quickly something that had existed only as a private dream in a worn notebook had become an actual, functioning thing, built not by his effort alone but by three people who had each, in their own time and their own way, decided it was worth their continued investment. He had been so careful, every step of the way, not to take that investment for granted, not to mistake gratitude for obligation or relief for permanent loyalty. He understood, watching them now, that what had actually formed instead was something sturdier than either of those things, a genuine, ongoing choice, renewed daily by each of them, to keep building this together. Chapter 15. Ryukyu had not transformed fully, without restriction, since the night Izuku found her dying in a collapsed parking structure, and the 6 weeks of careful avoidance had not gone unnoticed by anyone at Pac Hall, though nobody had pushed her to explain it until the renovated East Wing was finally finished and the training fields had grown large enough to actually hold her draconic form comfortably. You don't have to do this today, Izuku said, standing beside her at the edge of the newly cleared field on the morning she finally announced she was ready, his voice carrying none of the urgency it had held the night of her rescue, only a quiet patience that left the choice entirely hers. There's no deadline. Nobody's measuring how long it takes you to feel ready. I know, Ryukyu said. That's actually why I think I'm ready now. Because nothing about this is being forced. She looked out at the field, longer and wider than anywhere she had safely transformed in years, the high perimeter wall giving her room she had not had access to even during her most significant professional missions. I've been afraid, every single time I've thought about transforming since that night, that my body would simply stop answering me again. That whatever happened would happen a second time, and there'd be no warehouse this time, no detective's case file, nobody looking. There's 4 of us here now, Izuku said. If something goes wrong, you won't be alone in a collapsed parking structure for 11 hours before anyone finds you. I know that too. Knowing it and believing it under my skin are 2 different things. She exhaled slowly, some of the careful composure she habitually wore beginning to crack at the edges. I think I need to do this specifically because I'm afraid of it. I don't want fear to be the reason I never use my own quirk to its full capacity again. That's not recovery. That's just a different kind of being harvested, except I'd be doing it to myself. Mirko and Pixie-Bob arrived a few minutes later, drawn by some unspoken understanding that this moment mattered enough to witness, and the 4 of them stood together at the field's edge while Ryukyu closed her eyes, breathed once, deeply, and let the transformation take her. It happened the way it always had, the same shift in mass and shape Izuku had witnessed once before under circumstances of pure crisis, except this time, watching it unfold under open sky with nobody in danger and nothing at stake beyond Ryukyu's own decision to try, it looked entirely different, deliberate, controlled, almost graceful in a way the desperate transformation of that first night had never had room to be. She stretched her wings fully for the first time in weeks, testing the field's width, the high stone wall giving her exactly the clearance she needed, and let out a low sound that Izuku, after months of bonded contact and careful observation, recognized immediately as relief rather than distress. "She's okay," he said, quietly, mostly to himself, watching her move through a slow series of careful stretches and turns, reacquainting herself with a body she had been afraid to fully inhabit for 6 weeks. "You don't sound entirely convinced," Pixie-Bob observed. "I'm watching as carefully as I know how. If anything starts to look like that night, I'll bond the second she shows any sign of strain." He did not take his eyes off her. "But so far, this looks like someone using her own ability because she chose to, not because anything's forcing her hand. That's a different kind of transformation than the one I met her in." They stayed at the field's edge for nearly an hour while Ryukyu moved through the space at her own pace, eventually settling into a controlled hover above the open ground, wings spread fully against the afternoon light, and when she finally landed and shifted back, human again, breathing hard but steady, the expression on her face was one none of them had seen from her before, open, unguarded, something close to joy. "That felt like mine again," she said, walking back toward them, her voice thick with an emotion she made no effort to hide. "For the first time since that night, it felt like my own body, doing something I chose, instead of something I was afraid of losing control over." "That's worth more than I can probably tell you," Izuku said. "You can tell me anyway." "It means whatever was taken from you that night isn't permanent," he said. "It means you're not defined by the worst thing that ever happened to your own quirk. I didn't know, walking away from that hospital months ago, whether you'd ever feel safe doing this again. I'm glad I was wrong to worry." Ryukyu studied him for a long moment, then, with a directness that startled even Mirko, closed the remaining distance between them and pulled him into an embrace that had nothing performative about it, nothing measured or careful, simply the unguarded gratitude of someone who had just reclaimed something she had quietly feared was gone forever. "Thank you," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "Not for the rescue. For building somewhere I could come back to this slowly, on my own terms, instead of being told I should already be fine by now." "You don't have to thank me for that," Izuku said. "That's the whole point of this place existing." "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." She pulled back, composure already reasserting itself, though something in her eyes remained softer than before. "Don't get used to this. I don't make a habit of unguarded gratitude." "Noted," Izuku said, smiling, and behind them, Mirko made a loud, theatrical noise of mock disgust at the display of sentiment, while Pixie-Bob simply smiled and said nothing, watching the field where Ryukyu had just spent an hour learning, in the safest possible circumstances, that her own body still belonged to her. Chapter 16. 3 months after the deed to Pac Hall had been signed, the compound no longer resembled the overgrown ruin Mirko had once dismissed as a wreck on first sight. The east wing's roof had been fully repaired. The training fields, under Pixie-Bob's patient and increasingly precise direction, had become a genuine proving ground, terrain that shifted week to week, designed specifically to test the particular costs and limits of beast-type and transformation-type quirks rather than the generic obstacle courses standard agencies favored. A small medical wing, staffed by a single specialist Ryukyu had personally vetted and convinced to leave a prestigious hospital position, now stood ready to handle exactly the kind of transformation-related emergencies that the rest of the hero industry had spent the better part of a year failing to take seriously. It was not, by any official measure, a hero agency. It had no public registration, no flashy name recognized by the press, no merchandise, no rankings. It had 4 people who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to keep building something together, and a growing reputation, spreading quietly through the same underground channels Izuku had always relied on, that a place existed now for exactly the kind of hero the official system tended to overlook. He sat with the 3 of them one evening on the low wall outside the main hall, watching the last light fade over fields that had been wildflowers and rubble only months earlier, and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent years imagining a thing finally watching it exist. "It still doesn't feel real some days," he admitted. "Get used to that feeling," Ryukyu said. "I don't think it fully goes away. I've been here 3 months and I still occasionally wake up expecting to find this was a particularly vivid dream." "It's real," Mirko said, with characteristic bluntness. "You built it. we built it. Stop being surprised it worked. I'm not surprised it worked, Izuku said. I'm surprised it worked this fast, and I'm surprised it worked at all, given how careful I tried to be about not making any of you feel obligated to stay. That carefulness is exactly why it worked, Pixie-Bob said, quieter than the other two but no less certain. I've watched enough agencies manufacture loyalty through obligation to recognize the difference immediately when someone isn't doing that. You never once made any of us feel like we owed you anything for what you did. That's rarer than you seem to understand. The conversation drifted, as it often did in these evening hours, toward the future, toward what Pac Hall might eventually become if it kept growing at this pace, toward the steady trickle of underground referrals that had begun reaching Izuku's notebook again, new names, new patterns, the slow accumulation of a reputation he had never set out to build but found himself, increasingly, responsible for. It was Ryukyu who finally raised the subject none of them had spoken aloud in several weeks. Has there been any further word, she asked, about him? The shift in the evening's mood was immediate and unmistakable. Mirko's posture straightened. Pixie-Bob's hand drifted, unconsciously, toward the ground beside her, the reflexive readiness of someone whose quirk lived close to the surface of her instincts even at rest. Nothing direct, Izuku said. No new confirmed cases since Pixie-Bob. But the detective I work with has started hearing chatter through different channels, the kind of rumor that doesn't have a confirmed source yet but keeps surfacing anyway. Apparently word's gotten around, in whatever circles track this sort of thing, that something is being built outside the city. Something connected to the three of you, and to me. He knows about us, Mirko said. It was not a question. I think it's likely, yes. I don't have proof. But given everything we know about how patient and methodical he's been with every previous target, I'd be surprised if a pattern this visible, 3 rescues, all tied to the same compound, escaped his attention entirely. The silence that followed was not panicked, exactly, but heavy with the particular weight of people who had each, separately, already survived an encounter with the same threat and understood precisely how dangerous it was. Good, Pixie-Bob said finally, surprising all 3 of them. Good? Ryukyu repeated. I spent 2 months running myself into the ground because I thought I had to handle everything alone, and it nearly killed me. I'm not interested in waiting nervously for him to come find one of us isolated again. Her voice carried a steadiness that had not been there months earlier, in that substation, barely conscious and convinced she had to apologize for needing help. If he's watching us, then he already knows we're not isolated anymore. That changes the math for him, whether he likes it or not. It does, Izuku said slowly, turning the thought over. He's built his entire pattern around isolation, around finding people nobody's watching closely enough to notice when they go quiet. He's never had to account for a target who has 3 other extraordinary heroes and an entire compound standing behind her. Then let him come find that out the hard way, Mirko said, something fierce and eager creeping into her voice, the restless energy that had nearly gotten her killed months ago now finding a focus that did not feel reckless so much as resolved. I'd rather face him on our terms, all 4 of us together, than keep waiting to see which of us he decides to isolate next. Izuku looked between the 3 of them, weighing the very real danger of what they were describing against the equally real truth that waiting indefinitely, hoping the harvester simply lost interest, was its own kind of risk, one that left the initiative entirely in his hands rather than theirs. We're not ready for that confrontation yet, he said carefully. Not the way we are now. If we're going to face him eventually, and I think we will, whether we choose the timing or he does, we need to actually understand what he's become capable of, not just what he was capable of when each of you first encountered him individually. Then that's the work, Ryukyu said, the measured authority in her voice settling over the group like something solid to stand on. We stop treating this like 3 separate incidents and start treating it like exactly what it is. A threat that's been building for over a year, that's already touched all 3 of us, and that isn't going to simply go away because we're inconvenient to find anymore. The night settled fully around them, the lights of Pac Hall's main building glowing warm against the dark hills, and Izuku felt, beneath the very real unease of what they had just acknowledged together, something that had nothing to do with fear at all, the steady, grounding certainty that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone in a notebook full of names nobody else was tracking. He had built, almost without meaning to, exactly the kind of foundation that could actually hold against something this large. Whether it would be enough remained, for now, an open question. But it was no longer his question to answer by himself. Chapter 17. The detective who had handed Izuku his very first lead on the harvester, months before any of this had a name or a building behind it, arrived at Pac Hall on a gray morning in early autumn, driving an unmarked car up the long gravel road with the particular caution of someone who had never visited a compound that housed 3 nationally recognized heroes operating outside any official agency structure. "This is not what I expected," she said, stepping out of the car and surveying the restored main hall, the training fields beyond it, the unmistakable signs of a place that had been built with real intention rather than thrown together in haste. "Last I checked in with you, Midoriya, you were working out of a 1-bedroom apartment with a motorcycle held together by tape." "A lot's changed," Izuku said, meeting her at the gravel path's edge. "Come in. I think what you're about to tell me is going to need all 4 of us in the room." She raised an eyebrow at that, but did not argue, following him into the main hall where Ryukyu, Mirko, and Pixie-Bob were already gathered around a long table that had become, over the preceding months, the de facto center of every serious conversation the household had. "I appreciate you coming out here in person," Izuku said, once introductions had been made and tea poured, the detective settling into her chair with the alert posture of someone used to delivering difficult news. "What did you find?" "More than I'd like, frankly." She opened the same kind of folder Izuku remembered from their very first meeting in the warehouse district, though this one was considerably thicker. "We've confirmed 2 additional cases since Pixie-Bob's incident. Neither resulted in death, but both show the same signature, and both targets were, like the others, isolated and overextended at the time of the attack." "Who?" Ryukyu asked, her voice tight. "One independent hero working a rural prefecture with minimal agency support. One younger pro, barely 2 years out of licensing, covering an entire small city's perimeter alone because her agency couldn't afford additional staff." The detective's expression hardened. "Both beast type. Both recovering, but both showing the same kind of partial drain we documented in Pixie-Bob's case, the lingering leak that doesn't fully stop even once the attacker's gone." "He's accelerating," Mirko said. "That's our assessment too. Whether that acceleration is connected to what you've built out here, we can't say for certain. But the timing is difficult to ignore. He went from isolated incidents spaced months apart to 2 confirmed cases inside 6 weeks, right around the same period this compound went from rumor to confirmed reality in the channels we monitor." Izuku absorbed that with the same careful, methodical attention he gave every piece of difficult information, turning it over for what it actually meant rather than simply reacting to the alarm in the room. "If he's accelerating because he feels pressured by what we're building," he said slowly, "that means our existence is already changing his behavior, even before we've directly confronted him again. That's not nothing. That means the strategy of building something solid rather than chasing him individually was never just about protecting ourselves. It was already working as a form of pressure. It's also putting more people at risk faster," Pixie-Bob said, quietly. "If he's hunting more aggressively because we exist, that's not purely good news. People are getting hurt faster because of a fight we're already partly in." The room went quiet at that, the weight of the observation settling over everyone present, Izuku included. "She's right," he admitted. "I don't think the answer is to slow down what we're building. I think the answer is that we don't have the luxury of treating this as a long-term project anymore. We need actual intelligence on what he's become capable of, not just pattern recognition on where he's likely to strike next." "What do you have in mind?" the detective asked. "I want to understand his actual capabilities," Izuku said. "Not just what he can do to a single isolated target, but what happens when his harvesting meets someone properly supported, someone who isn't fighting him alone. We've each encountered him separately. None of us has faced him as a unit, with backup, with a plan instead of improvisation." "You're talking about deliberately engaging him," Ryukyu said. "Eventually, yes. Not recklessly. Not without preparation. But I don't think waiting indefinitely for him to make the next move serves anyone, especially not the people he's targeting faster now because of pressure we've already created just by existing." He looked around the table at each of them in turn. I'd rather choose the terms of that confrontation than have it forced on us the way it was forced on each of you individually. The detective studied the four of them for a long moment, the kind of assessment Izuku recognized from years of working alongside her, weighing whether what she was witnessing was reckless ambition or genuine readiness. I'm not in a position to authorize anything you're describing, she said finally. What you're operating is not officially sanctioned, which means whatever you decide to do next happens outside any framework that would normally protect you if it goes wrong. She paused. But I've watched you work for years, Midoriya, long before any of this existed, and I've never once seen you move recklessly. If you tell me you and the people sitting at this table are building towards something deliberate, I believe you. I'd just ask that you keep me informed, because whatever intelligence my department gathers on him, you're going to need it, and I'd rather coordinate with you than discover after the fact that you went in blind. That's all I'm asking for, Izuku said. Coordination, not authorization. We're not waiting on anyone's permission to protect the people he's still hunting. We're just trying to do it as carefully as the four of us know how. She left an hour later with a working arrangement that satisfied no formal protocol and everyone in the room equally, and after her car disappeared down the gravel road, the four of them sat together in a silence that had shifted, subtly, from the earlier tension of difficult news into something steadier, the quiet, settled resolve of people who had just agreed, without needing to formally vote on it, that the next chapter of this story was going to require all of them, together, facing something none of them could safely face alone. Chapter 18. Mirko found Izuku in the training field 2 evenings after the detective's visit, well past the hour most of Pac Hall had settled in for the night, running through a slow, deliberate set of conditioning exercises that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with extending exactly how long his body could function under sustained strain. You're not built for this, she said, dropping down onto the low wall to watch him work, her tone blunt but not unkind. I've watched you push your limits twice now in actual emergencies, and both times you came within a hair of collapsing. If we're really about to face him deliberately, on purpose, with a plan, you training alone at midnight isn't the plan I'd choose. I know I'm not built like you or Ryukyu, Izuku said, not stopping his exercises, though his breathing was already ragged from the effort. I can't outfight him directly. My entire value in a confrontation is how long I can keep absorbing strain on someone else's behalf while they actually do the fighting. If that's going to matter against someone like him, I need that endurance to be considerably higher than it currently is. So you're training your body to take more damage on our behalf for longer. Mirko's voice carried an edge that was not quite anger but sat close to it. That's not a plan, Midoriya, that's just you finding a more sustainable way to keep nearly killing yourself for the rest of us. He stopped, finally, breathing hard, and looked at her directly. What would you have me do instead? I don't know. Something that doesn't end every single time with you on the ground and the rest of us terrified you're not getting back up. She stood, crossing the distance between them with the restless energy that never seemed to fully leave her, and stopped close enough that he had to tilt his head up slightly to meet her eyes. You keep talking about not wanting any of us to feel obligated to you. Have you ever once considered that maybe we don't want you to feel obligated to bleed for us either? That maybe the thing you're building falls apart just as easily if you run yourself into the ground trying to protect it as it would if you'd manufactured our loyalty in the first place? The accusation landed harder than he expected, mostly because he recognized, immediately, that she was right in a way he had not let himself examine closely. I don't know how to stop, he admitted, quieter now. It's the only thing my quirk has ever been good for. Taking on what someone else is carrying. I spent my whole life being told that was all I was useful for, and somewhere along the way I think I started believing it was also the only way I was allowed to prove I cared about anyone. Mirko's expression shifted, the sharp edge in her voice softening into something more careful. That's not the only thing you're good for, she said. You found 3 of us when nobody else was looking. You built an entire place out of a notebook and a dream nobody else believed in yet. You held a room full of strangers together with nothing but honesty and stubbornness until we became something that actually works. She held his gaze, steady. None of that required you to nearly kill yourself. The bonding, the absorbing, that's a tool you have. It's not the entire measure of your worth to any of us, and I think you've been quietly treating it like it is. He had no immediate answer for that, the observation settling into him with the particular weight of something true that he had not wanted to look at directly. I don't know how to separate the two, he said finally. Caring about someone and being willing to carry what hurts them. It's always felt like the same thing to me. Then maybe that's something you actually need to learn how to separate, Mirko said. Because I'd rather have you around for the next 20 years occasionally letting the rest of us carry something for you, than have you burn yourself out being the only one who's ever allowed to bleed. The honesty in that landed somewhere deep, somewhere he had not expected a conversation that started with training exercises to reach. Okay, he said, and meant it, the word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. I'll try. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'll try. Good. She studied him a moment longer, then, with a sudden shift in tone that was somehow both teasing and entirely sincere, added, now get up. If you're determined to train anyway, at least train with someone watching your form instead of pushing yourself into the ground alone at midnight like some tragic lone wolf nonsense. He laughed, surprised, the tension of the previous moment breaking into something lighter. You're going to train me. Someone has to make sure you don't injure yourself doing this badly on top of everything else. She extended a hand, pulling him up from where he'd been kneeling, her grip firm and certain. Come on. If you're going to be useful to all of us in whatever's coming, you're going to do it properly, not through sheer stubborn willpower alone. They trained together for the next hour, Mirko correcting his form with blunt, practical instruction, neither of them mentioning again the rawer conversation that had preceded it, though something had settled between them in its wake, a layer of honesty that had not existed quite so plainly before. And when they finally finished and walked back toward the main hall under a sky thick with stars neither of them had time to appreciate properly in the city, Izuku found himself thinking that Mirko had been right about more than just his training regimen. He had built Pac Hall to make sure none of them had to carry their cost alone. He had simply never considered, until tonight, that the same principle might need to apply to himself. Chapter 19. The planning took 3 weeks, which felt to Mirko like 3 weeks too many, and felt to Izuku like barely enough time to account for everything that could go wrong. We know 4 things about him, Izuku said, standing at the long table in Pac Hall's main room, a hand-drawn map of the city's industrial districts spread out before all of them, marked with the locations of every confirmed encounter to date. He targets isolated, overextended heroes. He's patient, willing to observe before acting. He can drain a Quirk's underlying capacity either through sustained contact or, somehow, through a delayed mechanism that keeps working after he's gone. And Pac Bond interferes with whatever he's doing in a way nothing else has. That's not much to build a plan around, Pixie-Bob said. It's more than we had a year ago, and it's enough to use against him if we're deliberate about it. He tapped the map. He's never had to account for a target who wants to be found. Every single person he's harvested from has been someone trying to avoid him, trying to survive him, reacting rather than choosing the terms. If we draw him out ourselves, on ground we've selected, with backup he doesn't know exists until it matters, we take away the one advantage his entire pattern depends on. You want bait, Ryukyu said. I want a target he believes is isolated and overextended, in a location that actually favors us, with 3 of you positioned to intervene the moment his harvesting mechanism activates. Izuku looked around the table. I'm not going to pretend that's not dangerous. Whoever takes that role is going to have to actually convince him, which means actually being vulnerable enough that he believes it. I'll do it, Mirko said, immediately, before anyone else could speak. That's not automatically the right call just because you volunteer fastest, Ryukyu said. We need to think about who he's most likely to believe is genuinely isolated. You and I have public profiles that would make it strange for either of us to be alone and unsupported right now, given how visibly we've both been associated with this compound in recent months. Then it has to be someone whose profile still plausibly reads as solo, Pixie-Bob said slowly, working through the logic. Someone who hasn't been publicly tied to Pac Hall the same way you two have, or someone whose normal operating pattern would make isolation look completely unremarkable. The room went quiet as the implication settled. That's me, Izuku said. Absolutely not, Mirko said, immediately. We are not putting you out there as bait for the one quirk specifically designed to counter what makes you dangerous. That's not strategy, that's just handing him exactly what he wants. It's also the only profile that genuinely reads as isolated, Izuku said. I've spent 7 years building a reputation as someone who works alone. Nobody outside this room and a handful of detectives even knows Pac Hall exists in connection to me specifically. If he's been watching the way we suspect, an independent rescue specialist working a case by himself is exactly the kind of target his entire pattern is built to notice. And if his harvesting mechanism works on you the same way it worked on the rest of us, Pixie-Bob said, you lose Pac Bond. The one thing that's actually let us counter him every single time so far. Then that's exactly why the 3 of you need to be close enough to intervene the second anything starts, Izuku said. I'm not suggesting I go in completely alone. I'm suggesting I'm the visible target, while the 3 of you stay out of his immediate awareness until the moment he commits to the harvest. He's patient, but everything we know about him suggests he commits fully once he believes a target is secured. That's our opening. Ryukyu studied the map for a long moment, her expression carefully neutral, though Izuku had learned, over months of working alongside her, exactly what that particular stillness meant. She was running through every variable, weighing risk against necessity with the same measured discipline she brought to every major decision. I don't like it, she said finally. But I understand the logic. If we put forward someone whose profile doesn't genuinely read as isolated, he'll suspect a trap before he ever commits, and we'll have spent 3 weeks of planning for nothing. She looked up, meeting Izuku's eyes directly. I want conditions, though. Real ones, not negotiable. Name them. We rehearse the intervention timing until all 3 of us can execute it without hesitation. We choose a location with multiple points of cover close enough that the gap between his commitment and our response is seconds, not minutes. And the moment, the actual moment, any of us sees a sign that the harvest is taking hold faster than we accounted for, we abandon the plan and pull you out, regardless of whether we've learned everything we hoped to learn. Agreed, Izuku said, without hesitation. And, Mirko added, her voice tight with reluctant acceptance, you let one of us bond ready, the second this starts. Not waiting until you're already losing something. The second we have eyes on him, someone's hand is on you, sharing whatever this costs from the very first moment, not after you've already started bleeding for it alone. Izuku considered that, the echo of their conversation in the training field weeks earlier settling over the request, and recognized, with something that felt almost like relief, exactly what she was asking for. Okay, he said. Whoever's closest, the moment we have visual confirmation. I won't fight that. Mirko's expression eased, fractionally, the tension in her shoulders loosening at the simple fact that he had agreed without argument. Good, she said. Because I meant what I said before. You don't get to be the only one who bleeds for this family. Not anymore. They spent the following 2 weeks rehearsing the plan in exacting detail, walking the chosen location, an abandoned shipping yard near the Eastern Industrial Corridor that offered exactly the kind of isolated, overextended profile that would draw the harvester's attention while providing Ryukyu, Mirko, and Pixie-Bob enough natural cover to stay unseen until the critical moment. They tested response times until the gap between commitment and intervention shrank from a worrying 12 seconds down to a tight, controlled 4, Pixie-Bob shaping emergency terrain access points in advance, Mirko mapping the fastest possible approach from 3 separate hiding positions, Ryukyu coordinating the timing with the same careful precision she brought to every major operation she had ever led. By the time the detective confirmed, through her own channels, that recent harvesting activity had slowed in a pattern consistent with a predator who had grown cautious, perhaps aware he was being watched in turn, Izuku understood that the window for choosing the timing of this confrontation themselves, rather than reacting to his next move, was beginning to close. We go this week, he said, the final evening before they set the plan into motion, looking around the table at 3 people who had each, in their own way, already faced this man once and survived it. Whatever happens out there, we face it together. That's the entire point of everything we've built. Together, Ryukyu agreed. Together, Mirko echoed, no hesitation in it at all. Pixie-Bob said nothing, but reached out and placed her hand briefly over Izuku's on the table, a small, steady gesture that carried more certainty than words might have managed, and in the quiet that followed, the 4 of them sat together with the particular stillness of people who had done everything they could to prepare, and now simply had to face whatever came next. Chapter 20. The shipping yard at night carried the particular emptiness of a place built for activity and currently holding none, rows of stacked containers casting long shadows under sparse security lighting, the kind of location that would have struck any casual observer as exactly the sort of isolated, unsupported environment a solo rescue specialist might work a case in without thinking twice. Izuku moved through it alone, visibly alone, his posture and pace deliberately matching the pattern he had spent years building. A man following a lead, focused, unaware that anything beyond his immediate case might be watching him in return. Ryukyu held position in the shadow of a container stacked 200 meters out, close enough to intervene within the rehearsed window, far enough to remain unseen by anything short of deliberate searching. Mirko crouched on the elevated walkway of a defunct crane, her view of the yard nearly complete, her body coiled with the particular stillness she had spent weeks practicing specifically to suppress her usual restless energy until the exact moment it was needed. Pixie-Bob waited beneath the yard itself, having spent the better part of an hour earlier that evening quietly reshaping the ground beneath several key access points, creating concealed channels that would let her surface instantly at multiple locations the moment the plan called for it. They had rehearsed every variable they could think of. None of them had rehearsed for how long the waiting itself would feel. It was nearly 2 hours into the operation, long enough that Izuku had begun to wonder whether their entire theory about his caution had simply been wrong, when he felt the first subtle shift in the air, the same faint metallic warmth he remembered from every previous encounter with the harvester's presence, though fainter now, more controlled. "He's here," Izuku said quietly, into the small communication device tucked discreetly at his collar. "I don't see him yet. But the air's changed the same way it did before." "Copy," Ryukyu's voice returned, steady. "Hold your position. Let him commit." It took another 4 minutes of Izuku continuing to move through the yard, deliberately maintaining the posture of someone unaware, before the harvester finally stepped into view between 2 container stacks ahead of him, unhurried, his expression carrying the same clinical mild interest Mirko had described from her own encounter months earlier. "You've been looking for me," the harvester said, without preamble. "I find that curious. Every other target I've encountered spent considerable effort avoiding discovery. You've spent weeks, by my count, making yourself easy to find." "I'm not interested in avoiding you anymore," Izuku said, keeping his voice level, his body angled to give the watching team the clearest possible view of whatever happened next. "I'm interested in understanding what you actually want, and whether there's any version of this that doesn't end with more people losing pieces of themselves they can't get back." "What I want is simple," the harvester said, taking a slow, measured step closer. "Capacity. The kind few people are fortunate enough to be born with, and even fewer learn to actually use to its fullest potential. You'd be surprised how much of what people call their quirks limit is simply unexplored territory, once you understand how to access what's underneath it. That's not a justification. That's just theft with better vocabulary. Perhaps." The harvester did not seem troubled by the characterization. "Though I notice you've come here specifically, alone, by your own account uninterested in avoiding this conversation. I find myself wondering whether that's courage, or whether you've simply convinced yourself that whatever interferes with my work the way your quirk does will be enough to protect you regardless of how this proceeds. Maybe I just got tired of writing names in a notebook and waiting for the next one to almost die before I could act," Izuku said. "Maybe I decided facing you directly, on my own terms, was better than letting you keep choosing who suffers next." Something in the harvester's expression shifted then, a flicker of genuine interest beneath the clinical surface. "Admirable, in its way. Foolish, in most of the ways that matter." He raised one hand, the same gesture Mirko had described, palm open, and the air around Izuku tightened immediately, a pulling sensation he recognized instantly from her account, except now, experiencing it directly for the first time, the sensation carried a violence to it that no second-hand description had fully conveyed. It felt, immediately and unmistakably, like something reaching directly into the part of him that made Pac Bond possible at all, searching for purchase, testing the architecture of his own quirk the same patient, methodical way the harvester had tested everything else he'd ever taken. "Now," Izuku said, through gritted teeth, and the response was instant. Mirko dropped from the crane's elevated walkway in a single fluid motion, covering the distance to Izuku's side faster than the harvester's attention could fully track, her hand closing around his arm the moment she landed, the bond forming instantly between them. Pixie-Bob surfaced from the reshaped ground less than 2 seconds later, flanking the harvester's other side, raising a sudden wall of compacted earth that disrupted his line of sight and forced him backward a step. Ryukyu's transformation took her mid-stride, the shift from human to draconic form completing before she had even finished closing the remaining distance, landing with enough force to crack the pavement beneath her. The harvester's pulling sensation faltered the instant Mirko's bond connected, the same resistance Izuku had felt during her own rescue months ago now running in the opposite direction, his own strained quirk suddenly buoyed by hers, the violence of the harvesting attempt blunted into something he could actually withstand. Interesting, the harvester said again, the same word he had used in his very first encounter with Mirko, though this time there was less detachment in it and more genuine recalibration, his eyes moving rapidly between all four of them, assessing a situation that had clearly shifted far outside whatever calculation he had walked in expecting. "You've actually built something." "We have," Izuku said, steadier now with Mirko's strength bolstering the bond, Ryukyu's massive draconic form looming close enough to make any further harvesting attempt considerably riskier than the man had likely accounted for. "And it doesn't end here, no matter how this particular night goes." The harvester studied the four of them for a long moment, weighing something behind his calm expression, and then, with the same unhurried deliberation he had shown in every previous encounter, took a single step back rather than forward. "This was useful," he said. "Considerably more useful than I expected. I came to assess a rumor. I'm leaving with a clearer picture of exactly what I'm dealing with." His eyes settled on Izuku specifically, something almost like respect threading through the clinical detachment. "I don't intend to walk away from this conversation entirely. But I also don't intend to commit further tonight, against odds I now understand considerably better than I did an hour ago." "You're running," Mirko said, contempt sharp in her voice. "I'm recalculating," the harvester corrected. "There's a meaningful difference, though I understand why you might not see it that way." He took another step back, unhurried, entirely unconcerned by the four of them positioned to intervene if he tried anything further. "I'll see you again. All four of you, I suspect, given how thoroughly you've apparently decided to operate as a unit now." He turned, then, and walked into the shadowed gap between two container stacks, and by the time Pixie-Bob raised a wall of earth to cut off his escape route, the gap behind it was already empty, the harvester gone as completely and quietly as he had arrived, leaving the four of them standing in the abandoned shipping yard with adrenaline still hot in their blood and no clean resolution to show for 3 weeks of careful planning. Chapter 21. The drive back to Pac Hall passed in a silence that had little to do with exhaustion and a great deal to do with the particular disorientation of having prepared for weeks toward a confrontation that had ended without anything resembling resolution. "He just left," Mirko said finally, breaking the silence somewhere along the dark highway, her voice carrying the rough edge of someone still working through adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. 3 weeks of planning, and he just decided to walk away because the math stopped favoring him. "That's not nothing," Ryukyu said, from the back seat, her voice steadier though no less tired. "We changed his calculation. That's the entire point of what we were trying to do tonight. We didn't need to win a fight that wasn't actually the fight we were prepared for. We needed him to understand that targeting any of us individually no longer carries the same odds it used to." "It doesn't feel like enough," Pixie-Bob said quietly, from the passenger seat, watching the dark fields pass outside the window. "He's still out there. He still knows considerably more about us now than he did this morning. We spent 3 weeks preparing and the actual result is that he learned more from observing us tonight than we learned from observing him." Izuku, driving, said nothing for a long moment, turning the encounter over in his mind with the same methodical attention he gave every case, separating what had actually happened from what his own exhaustion and adrenaline wanted him to feel about it. "You're right that he learned more than we did, in terms of raw information," he said finally. "But I don't think that's the only thing that happened out there." He glanced briefly at Mirko in the rearview mirror. "The moment you bonded, his pull faltered immediately. Not gradually. Immediately, the way it never has in any of our individual encounters with him. I think that's data we didn't have before tonight, and I think it matters more than we're giving it credit for right now, while we're all still running on adrenaline." "What does it mean?" Ryukyu asked. I think it means Pac Bond doesn't just resist his harvesting on an individual level. I think when more than one of us is actively bonded at once, the resistance compounds in a way that caught him off guard tonight. He called it interesting twice, both times in a tone that suggested genuine recalculation, not performance. Izuku's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. He's patient. He's methodical. But tonight is the first time, in every account I've heard from all three of you, that he actually retreated from an engagement rather than choosing the terms of how it ended. The silence that followed carried a different quality than before, the four of them turning that observation over, weighing whether it represented real progress or simply a more comfortable interpretation of an otherwise unresolved encounter. I want to believe that, Mirko said eventually. I just don't want to convince myself we won something tonight when what actually happened is he walked away with new information and we're the ones left waiting to see what he does with it. Both things can be true, Izuku said. We didn't win, not in any clean sense. But we also didn't lose, and 3 months ago, none of you would have survived an encounter with him without immediate medical intervention. Tonight, all three of you walked away standing, and he's the one who decided continuing the fight wasn't worth the risk. That's not nothing, even if it's not everything we wanted either. They arrived back at Pac Hall well past midnight, the compound dark and quiet against the hills, and rather than immediately retreating to separate rooms, the four of them gathered instead in the main hall, none of them quite ready to be alone yet with what had just happened. I keep thinking about what he said, Pixie-Bob said, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the cold hearth, her earlier restlessness finally beginning to settle into something more contemplative. About capacity. About people not understanding what's underneath their own limits. I don't know why that's the part sticking with me instead of the actual danger of tonight. Because it's the part that almost makes sense, Ryukyu said, settling into a chair nearby. He's not entirely wrong, in the abstract. Most of us never test the actual outer edge of what our quirks could theoretically do, because the cost of testing it is usually too dangerous to risk casually. He's just willing to take that cost from people who never agreed to pay it. That's the whole difference, though, Izuku said. Between what we're doing and what he's doing. He's not wrong that there's more capacity in most quirks than people ever access. He's wrong about who gets to decide whether that capacity is worth the risk of accessing, and at what cost, and to whom. He looked around the room at the three of them, exhaustion and conviction mixing in his expression in equal measure. Pixie-Bob spent months learning her own sustainable limits specifically so she could decide, for herself, exactly how far she was willing to push. That's not the same thing as someone else deciding it for her and taking the difference by force. I know that, Pixie-Bob said. I think I'm just sitting with how thin the line actually is, between what he's doing and what any of us could theoretically justify doing if we convinced ourselves it was for a good enough reason. The observation landed with real weight, settling over the room, and Izuku felt something in his own chest tighten at the implication underneath it, an old fear he had carried since long before any of them had met him. The fear that the same ability that let him carry someone else's burden could, under different intentions, curdle into exactly the kind of control he had spent his entire adult life trying to build something opposite to. That's exactly why every single thing we've built has depended on choice, he said quietly. Not my choice. Yours. Every bond I've ever formed with any of you has required you to actually agree to it first, every single time. Not just once at the beginning and then assumed forever after. The day any of you stop choosing this, I need you to tell me, and I need to actually let that be real, not something I talk you out of because it's inconvenient for whatever I think we're building. Mirko, who had been quiet for longer than usual, finally spoke from where she stood near the window, looking out at the dark training fields beyond. None of us are anywhere close to stopping, she said. I think Pixie-Bob's just naming the thing that makes tonight feel unsettling even though we technically came out ahead. We just spent 3 weeks proving that what we've built can stand against him. That doesn't erase how much he still represents exactly the kind of danger that comes from someone deciding other people's bodies are his to take from. She turned back to face the room. We're not him. We never will be, as long as we keep doing what we did tonight. Asking each other before we act instead of just deciding for each other what's necessary. But I understand why facing him directly makes that distinction feel important to keep checking. The conversation wound down slowly after that, each of them processing the night in their own way, until exhaustion finally won out over the adrenaline still humming faintly beneath the surface of the room, and one by one they retreated to rest, the confrontation behind them inconclusive in the cleanest sense but undeniably, in ways that would take longer to fully understand, a genuine turning point in exactly how dangerous the Harvester now considered them to be. Chapter 22. The cost of that night did not announce itself immediately, which made it considerably more unsettling when it finally did. It was Izuku who noticed first, 3 days after the shipping yard, during a routine bonding exercise with Pixie-Bob meant to monitor the lingering leak from her earlier harvest, the one that had never fully closed despite months of slow improvement under careful management. "Something's different," he said, frowning, his hand still resting against her forearm, the bond active between them. "It's not the leak. The leaks actually continued improving, slower drain than even last month. But there's something else underneath it I haven't felt before." "What kind of something else?" Pixie-Bob asked, her own attention sharpening immediately. "I don't have a good way to describe it yet. It's like there's an echo where the leak used to be louder. A kind of residue, maybe, from however he initially embedded it." Izuku closed his eyes, focusing past the surface sensation toward whatever lay beneath it. "I think being that close to him again 3 nights ago, even without him directly targeting you specifically, reactivated something. Not the harvest itself. Some kind of marker he left behind that I never noticed before because it was dormant." They brought Ryukyu and Mirko into the conversation immediately, and within the hour, careful examination revealed the same unsettling pattern in all 3 women, faint but unmistakable once Izuku knew specifically what to search for, a kind of residual signature, dormant since their individual rescues, that had become subtly more active in the days following direct proximity to the Harvester himself. "He marked us," Mirko said, her voice flat with the particular fury of someone realizing a violation had occurred without her ever being aware of it happening. "Back when he first attacked each of us. Left something behind that we didn't even know was there until being near him again woke it back up. I don't think it's dangerous in the way the original attacks were," Izuku said carefully, still working through the implications himself. "It's not actively draining anything right now. But it means he has some way of tracking, or at least sensing, when any of you are nearby him again. Which means tonight wasn't just him gathering information about our capabilities. It might have been him confirming exactly what these markers were always meant to do." "Can you remove it?" Ryukyu asked. "The way you slowed the original harvest." Izuku considered the question with the same careful honesty he tried to bring to every difficult answer. "I don't know yet. I've never tried to address something this subtle, this dormant. The leak I countered before was active and ongoing, which gave Pac Bond something concrete to push against. This feels different, quieter, more like residue than an active process. I'm not sure resistance works the same way against something that's mostly just sitting there, waiting." The detective, when informed the following day, received the news with the same grim, methodical focus she brought to every escalation in the case. "This changes the threat model considerably," she said, sitting at the long table in Pac Hall's main hall, her expression tight. "If he can sense proximity through some kind of residual marker, that means every future encounter starts with him already aware you're near, regardless of how carefully you plan your approach. The element of surprise you built into that shipping yard operation isn't available to you again, not in the same form. Which means the next confrontation has to be planned completely differently," Izuku said. "We can't rely on him underestimating our coordination a second time. There's something else," the detective added, more carefully now, watching their reactions. "If he can sense the marker activating, that also means he likely knew, in real time, the moment all 3 of them were close enough together to coordinate against him that night. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Did he actually retreat that night because the fight stopped favoring him, or because he wanted you to believe that, while he gathered exactly the information he needed about how the marker functions under pressure?" The room went very quiet at that, the comfortable interpretation Izuku had offered 3 nights ago, that they had genuinely changed his calculation, suddenly considerably less certain than it had felt in the immediate aftermath of the fight. "Either is possible," Izuku admitted, after a long moment. "I don't think we can know for certain which it was without facing him again, and I'm not eager to test that theory carelessly." He looked around at the three women, each absorbing the unsettling implications of carrying something inside them they had not even known was there until days ago. I'm sorry. I should have checked for something like this the very first time I bonded with each of you, instead of assuming the visible crisis was the entirety of what he'd done. You couldn't have known to look for something invisible and dormant, Ryukyu said, though her voice carried a tightness that suggested the violation itself, regardless of blame, sat heavily with her. None of us could have. That's exactly the kind of advantage someone like him is built to exploit, the fact that his methods leave traces nobody thinks to search for until it's already too late. What do we do now? Pixie-Bob asked, quiet, the steadiness she had built over months of careful self-monitoring audibly shaken by the discovery that her own body had been carrying something foreign inside it without her knowledge for the better part of a year. Izuku did not have an immediate answer, and rather than offer false reassurance, he gave the only honest response available to him. We learn everything we can about what this marker actually is and how it functions. We figure out whether Pac Bond can eventually counter it the same way it's countered every other piece of his ability so far. And in the meantime, we operate with the assumption that he can sense, at minimum, when the three of you are in close proximity, which means every future plan has to account for that from the very beginning instead of treating surprise as something we can rely on twice. And if you can't counter it, Mirko said. If this is just something we're carrying now, permanently, whether we like it or not, then we figure out how to live with it without letting it control how any of you move through the world, Izuku said. The same way Ryukyu learned to transform again without fear ruling the decision. The same way Pixie-Bob learned her actual limits instead of letting exhaustion dictate them. Whatever this marker turns out to be, it doesn't get to be the thing that decides how the four of us choose to keep building this, any more than the original harvest got to decide that any of you were broken beyond repair. It was not a complete answer, and all four of them understood that, but it was an honest one, and in the days that followed, as Izuku began the slow, careful work of studying exactly what the harvester had left behind in each of them, the unresolved nature of that confrontation in the shipping yard settled into something the entire household carried forward together, not a victory, not a defeat, but the first real evidence that the man hunting them understood considerably more about how to make himself dangerous over the long term than any of them had fully appreciated until now. Chapter 23. Ryukyu found Izuku in the small study he had claimed as his own within Pac Hall's main building, surrounded by pages of careful notes mapping everything he had learned so far about the marker's structure, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. Can I ask you something that isn't strictly about strategy, she said. Always. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet deliberateness that told him this conversation was meant to stay private. When you first bonded with me, in that parking structure, did you feel it then? The marker. Or did it only become detectable once it was reactivated near him again? Izuku set down his notes, giving her his full attention, recognizing the question for what it actually was, not idle curiosity, but the particular need of someone trying to understand exactly how long she had been carrying something without her knowledge. I didn't feel it then, he said honestly. I've gone back through my own memory of that night more times than I can count since we discovered this, and I'm confident I would have noticed if it had been active or even detectable in any way. Whatever he left behind, it was completely dormant from the moment he attacked you until 3 nights ago. So for nearly a year, Ryukyu said, I've been carrying something of his inside me, and I had no idea, and neither did you, and the only reason we know now is that he happened to be close enough to wake it back up. Yes. She absorbed that, her composure, the same careful, measured stillness she brought to nearly everything, visibly straining at the edges. I built an entire recovery around the idea that what happened to me ended the night you pulled me out of that structure, she said. I learned to transform again. I let myself believe the worst of it was behind me, that whatever damage he caused was finite and addressed. And now I find out there was a piece of him still inside me the entire time I was doing that work, and I never knew, and you never knew, and neither of us had any way to know. I understand why that feels like it undermines everything you worked through, Izuku said carefully. But I don't think it actually does. The fear you faced, learning to transform again despite what almost happened to you, that was real. The choice you made, to use your own body deliberately instead of letting fear dictate it, that was real too. This marker doesn't erase any of that. It's a separate violation, one neither of us could have anticipated, but it doesn't make the recovery you already did any less genuine. Ryukyu was quiet for a long moment, processing that, before she finally sat down across from him, some of the rigid composure in her posture easing into something more openly tired. I keep thinking about the language you told me you hated, she said. From those old papers. Stabilizing. Anchoring. Treating a person's body like a problem to be managed by someone else. Her voice carried a rawness he had rarely heard from her. That's exactly what he did to me, isn't it? Without ever asking. Without me even knowing it happened. He treated my body like territory to mark and revisit whenever it suited him. Yes, Izuku said, because there was no honest way to soften that truth, and he had promised himself, from the very beginning of all of this, never to offer comfort built on dishonesty. That's exactly what he did. And I understand if that makes you angry, or afraid, or both at once. I'm not afraid, Ryukyu said, and there was a new edge in her voice now, something that had not been there a moment ago. I think I'm angrier than I've allowed myself to be about anything in a very long time. Because I spent 15 years building a career on the idea that I was strong enough to handle anything my own body required of me, and it turns out a stranger could simply reach into me and leave something behind without my consent, and I wouldn't even know until he chose to make himself known again. That anger makes complete sense, Izuku said. I'd be more worried if you weren't angry. What do I do with it? Whatever you actually need to do with it. I'm not going to tell you to be calm about this, or measured, or any of the things you've spent your whole career being for everyone else's comfort. He held her gaze steadily. If you need to be furious for a while, be furious. If you need to train harder, or talk less, or simply sit with this before you're ready to act on it, that's allowed too. The only thing I'd ask is that you don't carry it alone, the way you've apparently carried so much else. Something in Ryukyu's expression shifted then, the anger still present but no longer quite so isolating, and she reached across the small table between them, resting her hand briefly over his. Thank you for being honest with me, she said. Even when the honest answer is considerably worse than the comfortable one. I'd rather you trust every difficult thing I tell you than feel comfortable for a moment and then discover later I softened something that mattered, Izuku said. That trust is worth more to me than your comfort, even though I want both. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, deliberate gesture of acceptance, and when she finally left the study a few minutes later, her posture had not entirely lost its tension, but something in it had settled, the particular steadiness of someone who had been allowed to feel the full weight of an injustice without being asked to perform composure about it for anyone else's benefit. Chapter 24. Mirko did not seek Izuku out the way Ryukyu had. She avoided him for 2 full days instead, throwing herself into increasingly aggressive solo training sessions on the reshaped fields until Pixie-Bob finally intervened, quietly suggesting to Izuku that someone needed to actually talk to her before she trained herself into an injury out of sheer refusal to sit still with what she was feeling. He found her at dusk, mid-exercise, her movements sharp and controlled but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of barely restrained fury, each strike against the training dummy landing harder than the exercise actually called for. I'm not in the mood to talk about feelings, she said, without looking at him, continuing her sequence. I wasn't going to ask you to, Izuku said, settling onto the low wall at the field's edge, making no move to approach further. I figured I'd just sit here for a while. You can keep training. I'm not here to interrupt that. She continued for several more minutes, the rhythm of her strikes gradually losing some of their controlled precision as exhaustion began to outpace fury, until finally, breathing hard, she stopped, hands on her knees, sweat dripping onto the cracked earth beneath her. I keep thinking about every fight I've had in the last year, she said, still not looking at him, her voice rough with exertion and something underneath it that was not exertion at all. Every time I pushed myself past where I should have stopped. Every time I told myself I was the one in control of my own limits. And the entire time, there was something of his sitting inside me that I had no idea about, that could apparently wake back up whenever he got close enough. That's a fair thing to be angry about. I'm not just angry, she said, finally turning to face him, and the rawness in her expression surprised him, given how rarely she let anything beyond irritation or bravado show through. I'm scared, and I hate being scared, and I don't know what to do with that, so I've been hitting a training dummy for 2 days instead of figuring it out. You're allowed to be scared, Izuku said quietly. Especially about something like this. Finding out your own body's been carrying a piece of someone who attacked you, without your knowledge, for nearly a year, that's not a small thing to sit with. I've never been scared of him, Mirko said, and there was real bewilderment in her voice now, the disorientation of someone encountering an unfamiliar emotion in territory she had always considered solid ground. I fought him once already. I lost that fight, badly, and I still wasn't scared of him the way I am right now. Because losing a fight, I understand. Getting hurt, I understand. This is different. This feels like he was inside me the whole time, watching, waiting, and I never even knew to be afraid of that because I didn't know it was happening. Izuku let the silence sit for a moment, giving her space to finish the thought rather than rushing to fill it with reassurance she had not asked for. I think that's the actual violation, he said finally. Not just the harvest itself, which was bad enough. The not knowing. The fact that something happened to your body that you had no way of detecting, no way of consenting to or refusing, no way of even being aware of until circumstances forced it back into visibility. That's a different kind of harm than getting hurt in a fight you can see coming. How do I stop being scared of it? I don't know if you do, exactly, not completely. I think you learn to carry it the way Ryukyu's learning to carry her own version of this, the way Pixie-Bob carried her actual physical limits once she finally let herself acknowledge them instead of pushing past them blindly. He met her eyes steadily. I don't think the fear goes away by pretending it isn't there. I think it gets more manageable once you stop fighting it alone in silence and let the rest of us actually know what you're carrying. Mirko studied him for a long moment, something working behind her exhausted, sweat-streaked expression. You're doing the thing again, she said finally. Where you tell me something true instead of something comfortable. You called that out as the right approach yourself, a while back. I'm just trying to actually follow through on it. A short, surprised laugh escaped her, equal parts genuine amusement and the release of tension that had been building for 2 days. Fine. Fine, you're right. I hate that you're right. She walked over and dropped down onto the wall beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, her earlier rigid composure finally beginning to dissolve into something more honest. I don't know how to be scared without also being furious about being scared. That's just how I'm built. You don't have to know how yet, Izuku said. You just have to let someone else know you're carrying it, instead of running yourself ragged trying to outrun it alone. She was quiet for a while after that, the two of them sitting together as the last light faded fully from the sky, and eventually, without any particular ceremony, she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a small, uncharacteristic gesture of vulnerability that she did not explain and he did not comment on, simply letting it exist in the quiet between them. I'm still going to be furious tomorrow, she said eventually. That's allowed. Good. Because I am. She straightened, some of her usual sharp energy returning, though something underneath it had clearly settled. But thanks for sitting here instead of trying to fix it with words. That actually helped more than I expected it to. I didn't do much of anything. You sat with me while I worked through it instead of needing me to perform being fine for your comfort, Mirko said. That's not nothing, Midoriya. Most people can't manage that much. They walked back toward the main hall together as the last light disappeared behind the hills, and Izuku found himself thinking, not for the first time, that the work of building Pac Hall had turned out to require considerably more than rescues and renovations. It required exactly this, sitting in difficult silence beside someone who needed company more than answers, and trusting that presence alone could sometimes do what words could not. Chapter 25. Pixie-Bob's response to the discovery looked different from either of the others, quieter on the surface but, when Izuku finally understood what was actually happening, considerably more methodical than either Ryukyu's measured anger or Mirko's restless fury. He found her in the small medical wing 4 days after the shipping yard, surrounded by her own notes, carefully diagrammed alongside the medical specialist Ryukyu had recruited months earlier, the two of them deep in a conversation about the precise physiological signature of the dormant marker. You're working, Izuku said, somewhat unnecessarily, taking in the scattered pages. Someone has to actually study this instead of just being upset about it, Pixie-Bob said, not unkindly, though there was a brittleness underneath her focus that suggested the calm was costing her something to maintain. I spent months learning my own sustainable limits because I almost died not knowing them. I'm not going to sit around being afraid of something I could instead be learning to understand. That's a reasonable response, Izuku said carefully, as long as it's actually helping, and not just another version of pushing past a limit you haven't let yourself notice yet. She looked up at that, something flickering across her expression, caught between irritation at being read so accurately and a grudging acknowledgement that he was not entirely wrong to ask. I'm fine, she said, then, after a beat, more honestly, I'm not fine. But studying this is actually helping, not just distracting me from it. We found something, while you've been busy checking on the other two. She gestured him over to the notes spread across the table, the specialist nodding for her to continue. The marker isn't uniform, Pixie-Bob said. It's strongest in me, weaker in Mirko, weakest in Ryukyu. We think that correlates to how long each harvest was sustained before you intervened. Mine was the longest, the most active drain, which means whatever he left behind had the most time to embed itself deeply. Ryukyu's was shorter in terms of direct contact, even though her overall crisis lasted longer. That's useful, Izuku said, sitting down across from her, studying the careful diagrams she had built. If the marker's strength correlates to contact duration, that suggests it's not some separate ability layered on top of the harvest. It's a byproduct of the harvest itself, something that accumulates the longer his quirk is actively drawing from someone. That's exactly what we think, the specialist confirmed. Which means, theoretically, the same resistance Pac Bond has shown against his active harvesting might eventually work against the marker too, if you can find the right way to engage with it. It's just considerably more dormant and diffuse than anything you've successfully countered before. Izuku turned that over carefully, the implications settling into something almost hopeful for the first time since the discovery had upended the household 4 days earlier. I want to try something, he said slowly. Not today, and not without you both fully informed about what I'm attempting and why. But if the marker really is residue from the harvest rather than something separate, I think there's a chance I can engage with it the same patient way I've engaged with everything else his quirk has done. Slowly. Carefully. Testing the resistance without forcing anything that might cause harm. On me, Pixie-Bob said. It was not really a question. Only if you want to be the one we tested on first. You have the strongest signature, which means if it works at all, we'd likely see the clearest result. But that also means more risk if something goes wrong that we don't anticipate. Pixie-Bob considered that for a long moment, her earlier brittle composure settling into something steadier, more deliberate. I want to be the one, she said finally. I've spent the last 4 days feeling like my own body is a problem other people have to manage on my behalf. I'd rather be the one who actually does something about it, even if that means taking on more risk than waiting for someone else to volunteer first. That's a real choice, Izuku said, and I want to make sure you're making it because it's actually what you want, not because you feel like you need to prove something after feeling violated by all of this. Both things can be true, Pixie-Bob said, echoing, deliberately, the same words he had offered the group days earlier. I do want to prove something. Mostly to myself. And I also genuinely think it makes the most sense for me to go first, given what the data's already showing. She held his gaze, steady despite the tiredness underneath it. Let me choose this. Don't talk me out of it because you're worried about how it looks. Izuku held her gaze for a long moment, recognizing, with a kind of quiet respect, exactly the principle he had spent the entire project trying to build finally being handed back to him by someone determined to exercise it fully. Okay, he said. We do it carefully. We do it with the specialist monitoring everything, and Ryukyu and Mirko both present in case anything requires immediate intervention. And the second you want to stop, for any reason, we stop completely, no argument. Agreed. They scheduled the attempt for 2 days later, giving the specialist time to prepare proper monitoring equipment and giving Izuku time to study, as thoroughly as he could, exactly how his own quirk had engaged with every previous manifestation of the harvester's ability, searching for whatever pattern might translate to something this dormant and diffuse. It was, in its own quiet way, the first genuinely hopeful development since the marker's discovery had thrown the entire household into the kind of unsettled reckoning none of them had anticipated needing to face. Not a resolution. Not a guarantee of success. But a plan, built collaboratively, chosen freely by the person it would affect most directly, and Izuku found himself, walking back toward his study that evening, feeling something steadier settle into his chest for the first time in days. Chapter 26. The medical wing had been prepared with the same careful precision Pixie-Bob brought to everything she touched, monitoring equipment arranged in a careful perimeter around the reclined chair where she sat, Ryukyu and Mirko positioned close enough to intervene instantly, the specialist watching a bank of readings with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly how much could go wrong if this attempt unfolded badly. "Whenever you're ready," Pixie-Bob said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. Izuku knelt beside the chair and placed his hand against her forearm, the same contact point he had used in their very first bonding months ago, and closed his eyes, searching past the familiar territory of her physical exhaustion, past the faint, still improving leak from the original harvest, toward the dormant signature the marker represented. He found it almost immediately, now that he knew specifically what he was searching for, a kind of quiet residue sitting at the edges of where her Quirk's underlying mechanism lived, inert in a way that made it considerably harder to engage with than the active drains he had countered before. There was nothing pulling against him here, nothing to resist directly. Just a presence, settled and still, like a stone dropped into water long enough ago that the ripples had fully stopped. "I don't think I can push against this the same way," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone in the room, working through the problem in real time. "There's nothing actively happening for Pac Bond to counter. It's just sitting there." "Can you feel anything at all?" the specialist asked, watching the readings carefully. "I can feel where it is. I'm trying to understand if there's any way to actually engage with something this passive." He focused more deeply, searching for some thread of connection between the marker and whatever made it dormant rather than active, and slowly, carefully, began to understand something he had not anticipated. It's not separate from her Quirk's signature. It's woven into it, at the edges, like a thread that doesn't belong but has been there so long it's become part of the fabric anyway. "Can you pull it out?" Mirko asked, tension audible in her voice despite her attempt to keep it level. "I don't know if pulling is even the right framework," Izuku said slowly. "Everything Pac Bond has ever done has worked through sharing, not extraction. I've never tried to remove something from someone. I've only ever tried to help them carry what's already theirs." He opened his eyes briefly, looking at Pixie-Bob directly. "I don't think I can take this out of you the way you'd take out a splinter. I think, if anything works at all, it's going to work because we're sharing the burden of it existing, the same way we've shared every other burden, until it either fades on its own or becomes small enough that it stops mattering. Then do that," Pixie-Bob said, without hesitation. "Whatever that actually means, do it." Izuku closed his eyes again, refocusing, and this time, rather than searching for something to push against or pull free, he simply opened the bond as widely as he knew how, the same patient, deliberate act of sharing he had performed countless times before, except now directed specifically at the dormant thread woven through her Quirk's edges rather than at her exhaustion or pain. The sensation that followed was unlike anything he had felt in any previous bonding, a slow, almost imperceptible shift, as though the thread, rather than being torn free, was simply being asked to exist somewhere with more room around it, diluted across a connection wide enough that its presence stopped concentrating in any single place. "Something's happening," the specialist said, watching the readings shift. "The signature's not disappearing, but it's spreading. Thinning out. I don't have a precedent for what I'm looking at." "Pixie-Bob," Izuku said, "tell me what you're feeling." "Anything, even if it doesn't make sense." "Lighter," she said, her voice carrying genuine surprise. "Not gone. I can still feel it's there, somewhere. But it doesn't feel like it's pressing against anything anymore. It feels like there's more space around it than there used to be." They held the bond like that for nearly 20 minutes, Izuku maintaining the careful, patient sharing without forcing anything further, until the specialist finally called a stop, the readings having stabilized into a pattern that, while not eliminating the marker entirely, showed a measurable, significant reduction in its concentrated presence. When Izuku finally released the bond, both of them breathing harder than the exertion alone would explain, Pixie-Bob sat up slowly, testing the sensation with visible care. "It's still there," she said. "But it's quiet in a way it wasn't before. Like background noise instead of something actively sitting in the foreground." "That's not a cure," Izuku said carefully, not wanting to overpromise on results he did not yet fully understand. "I don't know if what we just did is permanent, or if it needs to be repeated, or if it works the same way for Ryukyu and Mirko given how the marker strength apparently varies between you. But it's something. It's more than we had an hour ago." "It's enough for today," Ryukyu said, moving forward to check on Pixie-Bob directly, her earlier measured composure carrying real warmth now. "You don't have to solve this completely in a single afternoon. You found a way to make it smaller. That matters." Mirko, who had been quiet throughout the entire procedure, finally spoke, her voice carrying an edge of something that sounded almost like relief. "So that's it. That's the actual difference between him and you, isn't it? He took something from her by force, and you couldn't even figure out how to take it back the same way. You could only figure out how to share the weight of it until it got smaller." "I think that's exactly the difference," Izuku said, quietly, the observation landing with the particular clarity that came from hearing someone else name a truth he had only half understood himself. "He works by extraction. I've never been built for extraction. I've only ever been built for sharing." It turns out that might actually matter, even against something this strange. The specialist scheduled follow-up sessions to monitor whether the reduction held over time, and to eventually attempt the same approach with Ryukyu and Mirko once Pixie-Bob's results were fully understood, and as the household settled into the evening that followed, the mood had shifted unmistakably from the unsettled dread of the preceding days into something closer to cautious hope, the first genuine progress against a violation that had, until today, felt like something none of them had any real power to address. Chapter 27. Ryukyu and Mirko underwent the same careful procedure over the following week, each session conducted with the same deliberate caution that had defined Pixie-Bob's, and each yielded results that, while not identical, confirmed the same underlying pattern. The marker could not be removed entirely, but it could be diluted, spread thin enough across the bond's shared width that its concentrated presence faded into something closer to background static than an active violation. Ryukyu's session went smoothest, her marker having been the weakest of the three to begin with, the dilution effect rendering it nearly undetectable by the time the specialist finished recording the final readings. "I can barely feel it at all now," she said afterward, sitting up slowly, testing the sensation the same careful way Pixie-Bob had days earlier. "It's not gone. But it's small enough that I don't think it's going to occupy the same space in my mind that it has the past week." "That's about as good a result as we could have hoped for," the specialist said, reviewing the data with evident satisfaction. "I'd still like to monitor periodically, in case it changes over time, but for now, this looks like meaningful, lasting reduction." Mirko's session proved more difficult, her marker, slightly stronger than Ryukyu's given the duration of her own encounter with the harvester, resisting the dilution process longer than either of the previous attempts, requiring nearly 30 minutes of sustained bonding before the readings finally began to shift in the direction they wanted. "You're pushing too hard," Izuku said partway through, feeling his own reserves beginning to strain against the unfamiliar, sustained effort required to dilute something this resistant. "I need you to actually relax into this, not fight it the way you fight everything else." "I don't know how to not fight things," Mirko admitted, her voice tight with the effort of trying to do exactly that. "It's the only way I've ever known how to handle anything difficult." "Try anyway," Izuku said gently. "This isn't a fight you win by pushing harder. It's one you win by letting the weight actually spread out instead of trying to brace against all of it yourself." She exhaled, slowly, visibly forcing her instinctive resistance to ease, and within a few minutes, the readings began shifting more readily, the marker's presence thinning the same way it had for the other two, until finally the specialist called the session complete, both Izuku and Mirko breathing hard from the sustained effort. "There," Izuku said, managing a tired smile. "See, you can let something happen without fighting it the entire way through." "Don't get used to it," Mirko said, though there was no real edge behind the words, just exhausted, genuine relief at the reduced sensation she could already feel settling into something more manageable. "That was harder than I expected." Letting go, I mean. Not the actual procedure. I know, Izuku said. It's hard for me too, most days, if I'm honest about it. That evening, the four of them gathered in the main hall for what had become, over the preceding months, their unofficial ritual of processing significant developments together, the mood lighter than it had been in over a week, though not yet fully free of the tension the marker's discovery had introduced. I want to say something, Ryukyu began, once they had settled with tea in hand, the fire in the hearth casting warm light across the room. About what this past week has actually shown us, beyond just the practical solution to the marker itself. Go on, Izuku said. He spent over a year building a method that let him violate people in ways they couldn't even detect, let alone resist, Ryukyu said. He's patient, methodical, considerably more dangerous than any of us fully appreciated even after surviving him individually. And yet the moment we actually worked together, openly, honestly, sharing exactly what we were each carrying instead of hiding it out of pride or fear, we found a way to address something his entire method depended on staying hidden. That's not nothing, Pixie-Bob agreed. I spent 4 days thinking I had to be the strong one, studying this alone because I didn't want to need help with something this invasive. It turns out the actual solution required all of us, together, doing exactly what he's never had to account for in any of his other victims. Cooperation, Mirko said. He's spent a year hunting people who fight him alone. We're the first ones who didn't. Izuku looked around the room at the three of them, feeling something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with a quiet, grounded certainty he had not let himself fully feel since the unsettling days following the shipping yard confrontation. I think that's the actual lesson underneath everything we've built here, he said. Not that Pac Bond alone can counter him. Not that any single one of us, including me, is strong enough to face what he represents in isolation. It's that the thing he's never built any defense against is exactly what we have now. People who choose, openly and repeatedly, to carry difficult things together instead of separately. Don't get philosophical on us, Mirko said, though her voice carried genuine warmth rather than her usual deflective teasing. We get it. Teamwork. Very moving. Can we also acknowledge that we still don't know when he's coming back, or what he's planning next, or whether this marker situation taught him something new he's going to use against us regardless of how good we feel about tonight? We can acknowledge both things, Izuku said, smiling despite the seriousness of her point. Feeling grounded about what we've built doesn't mean pretending the danger's gone. It just means facing whatever comes next from a steadier place than we were standing in a week ago. The conversation wound down slowly after that, settling into something quieter and more contented than the tension of the preceding days had allowed, and as the fire burned low and the four of them eventually drifted toward rest, Izuku found himself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever the Harvester eventually planned next, Pac Hall had just proven something important about its own foundation, that it could absorb a genuine violation, process it honestly without collapsing under the weight of it, and emerge from the other side steadier rather than fractured. It was not victory. The detective's warnings about an opponent who might simply be recalculating rather than retreating still hung over every conversation about the future. But it was, undeniably, exactly the kind of resilience he had hoped, against considerable odds, that this strange, deliberately chosen family might actually be capable of. Chapter 28. The Harvester became aware of the change in his markers roughly 2 weeks after the shipping yard encounter, the sensation arriving not as alarm but as a kind of distant, abstract curiosity, the way a scientist might notice an experiment had produced an unexpected result worth examining rather than discarding. He had embedded those markers deliberately, into every target he had harvested from over the preceding year, a quiet insurance policy that let him track, in the broadest sense, when his previous work remained nearby or had moved beyond his awareness entirely. He had never expected anyone to detect them, let alone interfere with them, because no prior target had possessed any ability remotely capable of perceiving something so deeply woven into the underlying structure of a Quirk signature. He recalibrated his understanding of Pac Bond's young wielder accordingly. He had already revised his assessment once, in the shipping yard, watching 4 people execute a coordinated defense with a precision that suggested weeks of deliberate preparation rather than improvised desperation. He revised it again now, sitting with the abstract sensation of 3 markers simultaneously growing fainter, diluted rather than removed, in a manner that told him something important about the actual mechanics of what he was dealing with. He had assumed, for the entirety of his methodical year of careful harvesting, that the fundamental nature of quirks made certain operations universal. Extraction worked because capacity, once accumulated in a person's body, existed as a discrete, isolable thing, capable of being drawn out and stockpiled elsewhere. He had built his entire collection on that assumption, and it had served him reliably across every target until the dragon's unexpected survival had introduced the first genuine anomaly into an otherwise smoothly functioning equation. This development suggested something more troubling than a single anomaly. It suggested an entirely different category of operation existed, one his own ability had never been built to perform and, more unsettling, one his own methodical study of quirk mechanics had simply never considered as a possibility. He extracted. The young man shared. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption directly, that sharing was merely a weaker, less efficient version of extraction, a half-measure performed by quirks too limited to actually take what they touched. He was beginning to suspect that assumption had been wrong, and that the distinction mattered considerably more than he had previously accounted for. He sat with that realization for several days, turning it over with the same patient, clinical attention he gave every significant recalculation, weighing what it actually meant for his continued work. If sharing represented a fundamentally different operation than extraction, rather than simply a weaker version of it, that suggested the young man's quirk might be capable of countering more of his methodology than he had initially assumed, given enough time and enough understanding of exactly how the mechanism functioned. It also suggested, troublingly, that the four of them now possessed information about his own ability that exceeded what he had previously assumed any target could ever gather. He had revealed, in that shipping yard, considerably more about his methods than he had intended, drawn out by his own curiosity about how Pac Bond would actually respond under direct, sustained pressure. He had treated the encounter as an opportunity to gather intelligence. He was beginning to understand, with the particular discomfort of someone realizing too late that an exchange had not been as one-sided as he had assumed, that they had gathered considerably more from him than he had gathered from them. He considered, for the first time since beginning his work over a year ago, whether his continued methodology required adjustment. He had built his entire pattern around isolated, overextended targets specifically because cooperation between potential victims had never previously presented an obstacle worth accounting for. The compound the four of them had built, and the marker's unexpected neutralization, represented the first serious evidence that his assumptions about isolation as a permanent advantage might require revision. He did not intend to abandon his work. The collection he had spent over a year accumulating remained too valuable, too central to whatever larger purpose he had been quietly building toward, to discard simply because four people had proven more capable of resistance than any previous targets. But he recognized, with the same clinical honesty he applied to every other aspect of his methodology, that continuing to underestimate this particular group would be a mistake he could not afford to repeat. He began, in the weeks that followed, shifting his attention elsewhere, deliberately avoiding any target whose profile might draw the four of them into direct confrontation again, choosing instead more isolated cases further from the city, harvesting with even greater caution than his already considerable patience typically allowed, while simultaneously dedicating careful private study to exactly what he had learned about Pac Bond's underlying mechanism during their single direct encounter. He had no intention of forgetting about them. He simply intended, for the time being, to let them believe they had bought themselves more safety than they actually had, while he quietly built toward whatever the next confrontation would require to finally account for an advantage he had badly underestimated the first time. Patience, he reminded himself, turning the private ledger's pages to a fresh section he had begun specifically to track everything he now understood about Pac Bond and the people who had chosen to bond themselves to its wielder. Patience had built his entire collection. It would serve him just as well now, regardless of how inconvenient this particular obstacle had proven itself to be. Chapter 29. The weeks following the marker's neutralization settled into something Pac Hall had not yet fully experienced since its founding, an extended stretch of relative quiet, no new confirmed harvesting cases reaching the detective's desk, no further sightings or rumors of the harvester's activity anywhere near the city, the kind of stillness that felt, after everything they had survived together, almost suspicious in its peacefulness. I don't trust this, Mirko admitted one evening. The four of them gathered for dinner in the main hall, the easy domestic rhythm of the meal a stark contrast to the urgency that had defined so much of the preceding months. He doesn't just give up. The detective's intelligence suggests he's still active somewhere, just further from here than before. I don't trust it either, Izuku agreed. But I also don't think the answer is treating every quiet evening like an emergency in disguise. We did real work these past months. We're allowed to actually exist in the result of that work, even while staying alert. That's a more balanced position than I expected from you, Ryukyu observed, with the dry humor she had grown increasingly comfortable showing since the night Izuku had first encouraged her to let it surface. Given your historical tendency to treat every available hour as time that should be spent preparing for the next crisis. I'm working on that, Izuku said, somewhat sheepishly, aware of exactly how much that observation owed to Mirko's blunt intervention in the training field months earlier. Apparently someone pointed out, fairly recently, that I don't have to be the only one carrying every weight all the time. Someone was right to point that out, Mirko said, with obvious satisfaction. The dinner continued an easier conversation than such gatherings had managed in weeks, the household settling into the particular comfort of people who had weathered something difficult together and emerged, if not unscathed, at least intact and steadier for having faced it honestly. Pixie-Bob talked at length about a new training configuration she was designing for the field, one specifically intended to help heroes recognize the early signs of overexertion before exhaustion became dangerous, a project she had begun, she admitted, partly inspired by her own near miss and partly by a growing sense that the lessons Pac Hall had learned the hard way might genuinely help others avoid the same fate. I want to actually open this up eventually, she said, gesturing broadly at the compound around them. Not just for the four of us. For anyone with a beast type or transformation quirk who needs somewhere to actually learn their own limits instead of discovering them the way I did. That's a significant expansion of what we originally built this place to be, Ryukyu said, though there was clear interest rather than hesitation in her tone. It doesn't have to happen overnight, Pixie-Bob said. But I keep thinking about how many people are out there right now, running themselves into exactly the kind of danger I was in, with nobody watching closely enough to notice. We built something that actually works. I don't think it's selfish to want other people to benefit from what we learned building it. Izuku considered the idea carefully, turning it over with the same deliberate attention he gave every significant decision affecting the household. I think that's exactly the direction this place was always meant to grow into, he said finally. I just want to make sure, if we do open it up, that we do it the same way we built everything else here. Slowly. Carefully. With real consent from everyone involved, not just good intentions assumed on their behalf. Obviously, Pixie-Bob said. I learned that lesson from watching how you built this with the three of us. I'm not about to abandon it the moment we start thinking bigger. The conversation continued late into the evening, the four of them sketching, almost without realizing how serious the planning had become, an early outline of what an expanded Pac Hall might eventually look like. Training programs for heroes whose quirks demanded costs the broader industry rarely acknowledged, medical infrastructure built specifically around transformation and beast-type physiology, a network of underground referrals that could eventually become something more formal without losing the careful, consent-driven foundation that had made the original four of them trust the project in the first place. It was Ryukyu, near the end of the evening, who raised the observation that settled over the room with particular weight. We're talking about this, she said, as though the danger from him is already behind us. I don't think that's accurate, and I don't think we should let this quiet stretch convince us otherwise. You're right, Izuku said. I think we can hold both things at once, though. We can plan for what this place becomes if we get to keep building it safely, while also staying realistic about the fact that he's still out there, and the quiet right now might simply mean he's recalculating rather than retreating. That's uncomfortable to sit with, Pixie-Bob admitted. Planning for a future we're not certain we'll get to have. Most good things get built that way, Mirko said, surprising the table with the quiet seriousness underneath her usual bluntness. Nobody gets a guarantee before they commit to something worth building. You just decide it's worth the risk anyway, and you build it as carefully as you can, and you face whatever comes when it actually comes instead of refusing to plan at all because the future isn't certain. The room fell into a thoughtful quiet after that, the weight of her observation settling over all of them, and Izuku found himself, watching the three women around the table, feeling a kind of gratitude he had rarely allowed himself to feel this openly, not just for their continued presence at Pac Hall, but for the way each of them had taken the foundation he had built alone for years, in a worn notebook nobody else had ever seen, and made it into something considerably larger and more resilient than he could ever have built by himself. "Thank you," he said, quietly, into the comfortable silence. "For staying. For building this with me, even after everything that's happened." "I don't think I say that enough." "You say it plenty," Ryukyu said, warmth threading through her usual measured tone. "We just don't always let ourselves hear it properly, given how much else there usually is to focus on." "Then let yourselves hear it tonight," Izuku said. "Because whatever comes next, whatever he's planning out there and whatever quiet corner he's currently occupying, I want all three of you to know that building this with you has been the best decision I've ever made, regardless of how the larger fight eventually resolves." Mirko rolled her eyes, though the gesture carried obvious affection rather than dismissal. "There he goes again, getting sentimental on us." "Let him," Pixie-Bob said, smiling. "We earned a sentimental evening. I think we're allowed exactly one before we go back to worrying about what comes next." The fire burned low in the hearth as the evening finally wound toward its close, the four of them lingering longer than strictly necessary in the comfortable warmth of the room, none of them quite ready to let the rare, hard-won piece of the moment end before it had to. Chapter 30. The call came 11 days after that evening by the fire, the detective's voice carrying a different quality than her usual measured professionalism the moment Izuku answered, something tighter, more urgent. "I need you to gather everyone," she said, without preamble. "I'm coming out to Pac Hall within the hour, and I need all four of you in the same room when I arrive." "What's happened?" 3 more confirmed cases, all within the last 2 weeks, all considerably further from the city than his previous pattern. Rural prefectures, smaller agencies, exactly the kind of isolated targets he favored before all of you became too dangerous for him to approach directly. Her voice carried an edge of genuine alarm now, the careful professional distance she usually maintained fraying slightly at the urgency of what she was reporting. "Midoriya, the pace has accelerated again, faster than even the increase we saw before your confrontation in the shipping yard. And there's something else. Something that changes the nature of what we're dealing with. Tell me now. Don't wait until you arrive." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of pause that told him whatever she was about to say carried weight she wanted to deliver carefully rather than rushed. The most recent victim survived long enough to give a statement before slipping into the kind of careful medical coma the specialists now use to stabilize partial harvest cases, she said. She described him asking specific questions before he attacked her. Not about her Quirk's general capacity, the way previous victims described. Specific questions about sharing. About bonding. About whether her Quirk could be split between 2 people simultaneously, the way a teacher might split a resource between 2 students. Izuku felt something cold settle into his chest at the implication. "He's not just avoiding us anymore," he said slowly. "He's studying us. Trying to understand if what Pac Bond does can be replicated, or weaponized, or somehow incorporated into what he's already built. That's our working theory, yes. And if he's actively researching whether sharing type abilities can be copied or adapted into his existing collection, that suggests he's not retreating from the threat you represent. He's trying to absorb it, the same way he's absorbed everything else he's ever encountered." By the time the detective arrived at Pac Hall less than an hour later, Izuku had already gathered Ryukyu, Mirko, and Pixie-Bob in the main hall, the easy warmth of the preceding weeks replaced by the familiar, focused tension that had defined so much of their time together before the recent quiet stretch had briefly suggested otherwise. 3 new cases, the detective said, laying out fresh files across the long table, the same kind of careful documentation Izuku remembered from their very first meeting in the warehouse district, now considerably thicker, considerably more alarming in scope. All survived, which is itself unusual, given his previous pattern of completing harvests fully when given the chance. "We think that's deliberate. We think he's keeping them alive specifically so they can describe what he's actually asking them, which suggests he wants this information to reach you eventually, whether through us or through whatever underground channels still track this kind of pattern. He's sending a message, Ryukyu said. That's our assessment, yes. What kind of message? Mirko asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer and simply wanted confirmation. That he's not retreating, Izuku said quietly, working through the implications with the same methodical care he brought to every difficult realization. That he's studying exactly what we did to counter him, and that he intends to find a way to account for it before our next confrontation, rather than simply avoiding us indefinitely. The room absorbed that in heavy silence, the rare peace of the preceding weeks giving way fully now to the familiar weight of a threat that had never actually disappeared, only paused long enough to recalculate. What do we do? Pixie-Bob asked, the question carrying none of the fear it might have carried months earlier, replaced instead by the steady, deliberate focus of someone who had already proven, to herself and to the others, that she could face this kind of uncertainty without collapsing under it. Izuku looked around the table at the three women who had transformed his solitary, years-long dream into something real, something that had already survived a direct confrontation and a hidden violation and emerged from both steadier rather than broken, and felt, beneath the very real fear of what the detective's news represented, a grounded certainty that had not existed in him a year ago, before any of them had chosen to build this alongside him. We do what we've always done, he said. We face this honestly, together, and we figure out exactly what he's trying to learn about us before he learns enough to actually use it. If he's studying Pac Bond, then we need to understand his ability with the same depth he's apparently studying ours. Not just how to resist it. How it actually works, at the deepest level we can manage, so that whatever he's building toward, we're not walking into it blind a second time. That means actually understanding him, Ryukyu said. Not just defending against him. Yes, Izuku said. I think the time for purely defensive preparation ended the moment he decided to start asking his victims questions about us instead of simply harvesting them the way he always has. He's already studying us deliberately. We need to start doing the same to him, with everything the detective and her department can provide, and everything the four of us have learned firsthand from facing him directly. The detective began organizing the new case files into the same kind of methodical pattern Izuku had built his entire reputation around, years ago, in a notebook nobody else had thought worth keeping, and as the household settled into the focused, determined work of building their next strategy, the quiet peace of the preceding weeks gave way fully to the unmistakable understanding that whatever came next would require more from all of them than anything they had faced so far. Outside, beyond the high stone walls Pixie-Bob had spent months reshaping into proper training ground, the autumn evening settled into darkness over hills that had, for one brief, hard-won stretch, felt entirely safe. That feeling, all four of them understood now, had always been borrowed time. The real test was still ahead of them. Chapter 31. They worked through the night, the detective staying far longer than her usual visits allowed, the five of them spreading every available piece of intelligence across the long table until the main hall resembled less a home and more the kind of operations center none of them had ever expected Pac Hall to require. If he's trying to understand whether sharing type quirks can be replicated, Izuku said, somewhere past midnight, his voice hoarse from hours of careful analysis, then the most dangerous version of this is if he's not just asking victims theoretical questions. He might be testing pieces of it directly, in small, controlled ways, the same patient methodology he's used for everything else. Testing it how? Pixie-Bob asked, exhaustion audible in her voice but her focus undiminished. I don't know yet. That's exactly the problem. Pac Bond isn't something you can simply observe from the outside and reverse engineer. It requires consent, intent, and actual bond forming between two willing participants. If he's trying to replicate that mechanism through extraction, through force, I genuinely don't know what the result would even look like, because nothing about how my quirk works was ever built to function that way. Maybe that's the answer, Ryukyu said slowly, working through the logic out loud. Maybe he can't actually replicate it, not in any functional sense, because the entire mechanism depends on something extraction fundamentally can't provide. Willing connection. If that's true, then whatever he's attempting to build from this research might be doomed to fail regardless of how much he studies it. I'd like to believe that, the detective said, looking up from the files she had been cross-referencing for the better part of an hour. But I'd be cautious about assuming his methodology can't adapt simply because the underlying mechanism seems incompatible with force. He's spent over a year finding ways to extract things that should have been equally impossible to take by force. I wouldn't bet on him simply giving up because the obstacle looks insurmountable on paper. Mirko, who had been quiet for longer than usual, finally voiced the question that had clearly been building beneath her silence. What if he's not trying to replicate it for himself, she said. What if he's trying to understand it well enough to counter it instead? Find the specific weakness in how Pac Bond actually functions, the same way we found the specific weakness in how his harvesting worked. The room went still at that, the possibility settling over all of them with considerably more weight than the previous theories had carried. That's a more dangerous possibility, Izuku admitted. If he's not trying to copy what I can do, but trying to find a way to neutralize it specifically, that changes everything about how careful we need to be in any future encounter. He'd be targeting the one tool that's consistently worked against him, rather than trying to add it to his own collection. Which means our next confrontation can't depend entirely on the same strategy that worked in the shipping yard, Ryukyu said. If he's found a way to counter the bonding mechanism itself, even partially, we need contingencies that don't rely solely on Pac Bond functioning the way it always has. Agreed, Izuku said. Which means the next phase of preparation isn't just about understanding him better. It's about making sure the four of us aren't depending on a single mechanism that he might already be working to neutralize. The detective began compiling a more detailed timeline of every confirmed case, marking patterns in geography, victim profile, and the specific questions reported by survivors, while Pixie-Bob and Ryukyu worked through the practical implications of building contingency plans that did not rely entirely on bonding, and Mirko, restless as ever but channeling it now into focused, productive energy, began sketching alternate combat strategies that played to each of their individual strengths. Independent of Izuku's involvement entirely. It was well past 2 in the morning when the detective finally prepared to leave, the table covered in notes, diagrams, and the careful beginnings of a strategy considerably more sophisticated than anything they had built before the shipping yard. I'll keep you updated as new information comes in, she said, gathering her files. And I'd ask, in return, that you keep me informed of whatever you learn from your own analysis. Whatever's coming next, I don't think either of us can afford to work this in isolation anymore. Understood, Izuku said, walking her out to her car, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the focused warmth of the main hall behind them. Thank you for bringing this directly instead of waiting for an official channel to process it first. I learned a long time ago that you're worth trusting with difficult information faster than most official channels would ever move, the detective said, pausing at her car door. I just hope, whatever this turns into, that trust ends up justified rather than costing all of you more than it should. She drove off into the dark, and Izuku stood for a long moment in the cold, looking back at Pac Hall's lit windows, where Ryukyu, Mirko, and Pixie-Bob continued working through the implications of everything they had just learned, before finally walking back inside to rejoin them. We should sleep, Ryukyu said, when he returned, though she made no move to actually stop working herself. We're not going to solve this entirely tonight, and exhausted strategy is rarely good strategy. In a minute, Izuku said, settling back into his chair at the table, looking around at the three of them, each absorbed in their own piece of the larger puzzle, each having transformed, over the better part of a year, from individual rescues in his worn notebook into something he had never quite let himself imagine in the early, solitary years of this work, genuine partners, equally invested, equally capable, equally determined to see this through to whatever ending it eventually found. I want to say something, he said, and the room's attention shifted toward him, sensing the shift in his tone. Whatever he's planning, whatever he's learned about us, I don't think it changes the fundamental truth of what we've built here. He's spent over a year studying how to take things from people who couldn't stop him. We've spent the same year learning how to give things to each other freely, by choice, again and again, in ways he's never had to account for in anyone else he's encountered. That's not a strategy, Mirko said, though her voice carried warmth rather than dismissal. That's just you being sentimental again. Maybe, Izuku said, smiling despite the exhaustion and uncertainty of the hour. But I think it's also true, and I think it's worth saying out loud before we go back to the harder work of actually preparing for whatever he's building toward. We're not just defending something here. We're proving, every single day we keep choosing this together, that what he represents isn't the only way extraordinary quirks get to exist in the world. The room settled into a thoughtful quiet at that, the weight of the observation mixing with the exhaustion of the long night, until finally, one by one, they began gathering the scattered notes into something more organized, preparing to finally rest before the work continued in earnest the following day. Whatever the harvester was building toward, whatever he had learned from his careful, methodical study of everything that had gone wrong for him in that shipping yard, the four of them walked into the next chapter of this fight with something he had never once had to account for in any of his previous victims, a foundation built entirely on choice, tested already by violation and confrontation alike, and proven, again and again, to hold,